He built the weapon that destroyed his own people. He never fired it. He never had to. He simply drew the lines, handed over the plans, and walked away. And somewhere across the galaxy, in the years that followed, the thing he designed on paper became the thing that erased his world from the stars. This is not a story about a villain. It is a story about a name. The tunnels beneath Geonosis were always warm, not the warmth of sunlight or fire, the warmth of deep rock, old heat, pressed down for millions of years, rising slowly through the stone, like a memory the planet could not release. The air tasted of iron. The walls were amber-colored, faintly glowing, cut by hive workers over generations until the passages curved and branched like the inside of something living. In the lowest level of the Geonosian hive, in a small rounded chamber far below the rest, a membrane was thinning. Inside it, something was waiting to be born. The Archduke Hadis arrived alone. He stood at the chamber entrance and watched the membrane split open at the base. A small figure pushed through, smaller than expected, wings slow to open, body narrow and thin against the amber glow of the walls. Hadis looked at the newborn heir for a long moment. Then he spoke a name. In the old Geonosian tongue, the name meant one specific thing: the one who is not enough. He turned and walked back up the tunnel. His footsteps faded. The attendant drones recorded the name in the hive logs. The small figure lay in the remnants of the membrane, compound eyes open, catching the light. No one in that chamber understood what had just been set in motion. A name given at birth in Geonosis was not decoration. It was not tradition for its own sake. It was a verdict, the hive's formal assessment of what a new life was worth before that life had done anything at all. Most hive-born Geonosians grew into their names the way roots grow into soil. The shape was already decided. They simply filled it. Poggle the Lesser did not do this. He could not have explained why, even if he had tried. There was no single moment of resistance. No clear decision, no point where he looked at the name and chose to fight it. It was quieter than that. It was the specific, slow refusal of a creature who simply kept working, kept designing, kept calculating, kept building long past the point where a lesser ambition would have accepted the ceiling above it. He worked in the construction guilds. He drew plans for tunnel expansions, chamber reinforcements, smelting systems. The designs were good, better than good. The senior engineers above him knew this because they used the designs constantly, adjusted them slightly, and filed them under their own names. Poggle signed the lower documents and went back to his work area. He said nothing. He watched everything. The first thing you noticed, working near him, was the stillness. Not the stillness of someone with nothing going on inside. The opposite. The stillness of a mind, running so many calculations at once that the body had learned to go quiet to give it room. Other drones chatted during construction shifts, traded complaints about assignments, made the small social sounds that hive creatures make when working in close quarters. Poggle was almost always silent. What he was doing in that silence was harder to see. He was mapping not just the physical structure of whatever project he had been assigned to, he was mapping the people around it. Who made decisions and who only appeared to, who took credit and who produced the work that credit was taken from, where the real authority in the hive lived and where it was only performed. He stored none of this in writing. He kept it in the one place the attribution system could not reach. There was a sound he always stopped for. When a resonance drill entered fresh rock for the first time before the grinding and the dust, there was a half-second where the stone simply gave, opened, produced a single clean tone unlike anything else in the tunnels. Poggle paused every time he heard it, just for that moment. Then he moved on. Nobody else seemed to notice it at all. He was 37 years old when an off-world trader came to the hive for an ore negotiation. The trader was Namoidian. He had a name on a datapad and no knowledge of what it meant. He looked up from the pad, found the figure standing across the table from him, and said the name the same way you say a street address flat, functional, just a way to locate something. Poggle? Good. I need help with the Eastern intake specs. Just a name. No weight behind it. No verdict. No ceiling built into the syllables. Just sound. Poggle answered the questions. He was so precise, so thorough, that the trader sent a message to his company, recommending that all future dealings go through this specific junior architect and no one else. The message was flagged by senior guild management before it reached anyone useful. Filed away. Forgotten. Poggle was never told about it. He already knew how the system handled things like him. The Deep Foundry project was the biggest construction job the Stalgazen hive had ever attempted. 3 new chamber levels cut below the existing network, new smelting capacity, and a ventilation design that had to solve a heat problem that had collapsed 2 earlier attempts. The senior engineer in charge was experienced and well-regarded. He also had a significant error in his approach to the airflow system, one that Poggle identified within the first week. Poggle said nothing for 14 days. During those 14 days, on his own time, in his own quarters, he produced a complete alternative design. Every number checked twice. He brought it to the senior engineer as a suggestion framed carefully, deferentially, as a minor additional option rather than a fix. The engineer studied it for 2 hours. Then he presented it to the project committee as his own refinement. The design was built. The foundry worked. The senior engineer received a commendation at a ceremony in the upper assembly hall. Poggle was 60 meters below that hall, standing on the floor of the chamber he had designed, listening to the faint vibration of applause passing down through the rock above him. The chamber was large. The ceiling curved in a shape his calculations had required. The air moved slowly along the upper walls, in patterns only he had known to create. Everything functioned the way he had known it would. He stood at the edge and looked at it, not with anger, not with grief, with the quiet, clear attention of someone arriving at a conclusion that has been building for a very long time. He could keep making things for other names to own, or he could find a different way. He did not know yet what that way would cost. He did not know about the exile coming, or the war, or the plans he would one day draw and hand to a man in a dark robe, or what those plans would eventually become. He could not see any of that from where he stood. He only understood one thing. In the warm, amber air of a chamber, no one would ever credit him for building. A name given at the start of a life is not the same as the end of it. Not if you are patient. Not if you are willing to pay whatever the distance between lesser and enough actually costs. He did not yet know that cost would be measured in world. The tunnels were the same when he walked back through them. The iron smell, the amber walls, the distant sound of drills opening fresh rock. One clean tone at the start before the grinding took over. He paused for it, as he always did. Then he kept walking. The decision made in that deep chamber had no name yet. It had no shape he could have drawn on paper. It was simply a door, quietly closing behind him, and he walked through it the same way he did everything else, without drama, without looking back, with the complete, patient attention of a creature who had always known, even when nothing else confirmed it, that he was building towards something the hive had never thought to make room for. There is a specific kind of pain that has no sound, Not the pain of a wound or a loss. The pain of watching something you made become something someone else owns and being unable to say a single word about it. Because the system that took it from you is the same system that gives you food and shelter and a place to sleep at night. Poggle knew this pain the way he knew the tunnels, completely, from memory, in the dark. His middle decades inside the Geonosian hive were, by every visible measure, unremarkable. He showed up. He worked. He submitted plans on schedule. He attended the reviews where senior engineers nodded at his solutions and wrote their own names at the top of the documentation. He ate in the lower guild hall with the other junior architects. He slept in the quarters assigned to his rank. From the outside, he looked like exactly what his name said he was. From the inside, something else entirely was happening. The lower foundry expansion took 3 years. It was Poggle's first large-scale project, not as lead architect, never as lead, but as the junior designer whose work the lead architect could not have completed without. The job involved pushing the hive's existing smelting chambers 40 meters deeper into the bedrock, reinforcing the tunnel walls against the increased ground pressure at that depth, and designing a drainage system for the underground water that the new excavation would disturb. The lead architect, a senior engineer named Voss, had a confident manner and a talent for presenting other people's thinking as his own. He had been doing it for decades. He was very good at it. He was less good at drainage systems. Poggle spent 11 nights working on the water problem alone. The solution he arrived at was not complicated once you saw it. A series of angled channels cut at specific depths that used the natural slope of the bedrock to redirect groundwater away from the smelting area without any mechanical pumping. Simple, elegant, requiring no ongoing maintenance. Voss looked at the design for about 4 minutes before signing his name to it. The drainage system was still functioning 40 years later. Nobody who used it knew who had drawn the original lines. Poggle knew. He added it to the catalog he kept in his head, the private record of everything he had built that lived under someone else's name. He did not do this out of bitterness. He did it the way a careful person keeps accounts. Because accounts, properly kept, eventually tell you something useful. The second project was different. Not in structure, the attribution system worked the same way it always had, but in scale, and in what it revealed about what Poggle was becoming. The Geonosian hive had been approached by a Trade Federation subsidiary about adapting Geonosian tunnel boring techniques for use in droid manufacturing. The Federation needed a faster way to produce internal chassis components for its battle droid line. Someone in their logistics division had noticed that the precision cutting methods Geonosian workers used for hive expansion produced tolerances tighter than anything the Federation's own factories could achieve. The project landed in the Guild's technical division. It landed, eventually, on Poggle's work surface. What he was being asked to do, in simple terms, was translate a building technique into a manufacturing process. Take something designed for rock and make it work for metal. The engineers above him assumed this would take the better part of a year. Poggle produced a working framework in 6 weeks, not because he was rushing, because the translation was, to his mind, obvious. Rock and metal were both materials with internal structure, stress tolerances, and failure points. The tools that read one could be calibrated to read the other. The hive workers who cut tunnels with such precision were performing the same fundamental operation as a droid factory assembly line. They were just doing it in a different medium. He wrote this up in a 20-page technical document that used plain language and clear diagrams. He gave it to his section supervisor. His section supervisor gave it to the divisional head. The divisional head presented it to the Federation representatives with small modifications and significant confidence. The Federation paid the hive very well for the framework. Poggle's name appeared nowhere in the agreement. But the Federation logistics coordinator who attended the signing, a Neimoidian named Dara, had read the technical document carefully enough to notice that the thinking inside it was unlike anything produced by the engineers who were taking credit for it. He filed this observation privately. He did not act on it immediately. He would remember it later. The Petronaki Arena was the project Poggle was most proud of, and the one he was least able to say so about. The arena had been ordered by Hades, a new execution and entertainment facility befitting the hive's growing status as a regional power in the Outer Rim. It needed to hold large numbers of spectators in tiered seating cut directly into the rock face. It needed a central floor large enough for multiple simultaneous engagements. It needed acoustics that would carry sound from the arena floor to the highest tier without mechanical amplification. Most critically, it needed to not collapse. Several previous Geonosian arenas had partial structural failures during high-attendance events. The ground vibration produced by thousands of Geonosians responding simultaneously to arena spectacle created resonance frequencies that standard construction methods had failed to account for. Poggle spent 4 months on the resonance problem before he solved it. The solution involved foundation columns placed at intervals based not on standard engineering spacing, but on the specific acoustic properties of the surrounding rock. Each column was positioned to interrupt the resonance frequency before it could build to dangerous levels. The spacing looked irregular to anyone who did not understand what it was doing. Several senior engineers questioned it. Poggle explained it in terms simple enough that they could not argue with the numbers. They built it his way because the numbers were correct. They signed their names to it because that was how the system worked. The Petronaki Arena stood for decades. It held thousands. The foundation columns interrupted every dangerous vibration exactly as calculated. And when, many years later, Republic gunships and clone troopers fought across that arena floor during the opening hours of a war that would reshape the entire galaxy, the structure did not fall. It held, because Poggle had made sure it would. He never watched any of the events held there without feeling, somewhere beneath every other thought, the specific sensation of standing in a space that exists because of you, surrounded by people who do not know that. It was during the arena project that he began building the other thing. Not a structure, not a design, a network. It started with Dara, the Federation coordinator, who had noticed the thinking behind the droid manufacturing framework. Dara reached out through a mutual trade contact, carefully and without any formal channel, to ask whether the architect responsible for a particular technical document might be interested in a private consultation on a separate project. Poggle agreed to the meeting. He did not tell anyone in the hive about it. They met in a supply depot on the outer edge of Geonosis's ring of trading posts, a neutral location, unremarkable, the kind of place where off-world business happened without drawing attention. Dara was direct. He had identified a gap in Federation manufacturing logistics that required the specific kind of structural thinking that the Stalgassan technical document had demonstrated. He was prepared to pay for access to that thinking, privately, outside of any official hive agreement. Poggle listened to the entire proposal. Then he named a price that was significantly higher than what Dara had offered. Dara agreed without negotiating. This told Poggle everything he needed to know about how much his thinking was actually worth, and how wide the gap was between that value and what the hive's attribution system had been paying him for it. He did 4 more private consultations over the following 2 years, each one built on the last. Each one introduced a new contact, a new off-world relationship, a new thread in a web that existed entirely outside the hive's official records. He was not doing anything the hive had specifically forbidden. The rules around private consultation were vague enough to provide cover, but he was doing something that, if fully understood, the senior guild administration would not have permitted. He was building a parallel version of himself, one that operated in the spaces between systems, one that accumulated relationships and obligations and trust from people who had no stake in keeping him in his designated position. He filed none of this anywhere. He kept it the same place he kept everything that mattered. He saw what was happening to Hades by accident. He had been summoned to the upper administrative level for a routine project review, one of the rare occasions when junior architects were brought above the guild floor to present work in person. While waiting in the outer corridor, he heard voices from inside the Archduke's meeting chamber. One of the voices was Hades. Not the Hades from Poggle's early years, the one who had moved through the lower chambers with the unhurried confidence of something that has never been questioned. This voice was slower. There were pauses in places where Poggle did not remember pauses. The other voices in the room were filling those pauses a fraction too quickly, the way people do when they are used to covering for someone. The meeting ended. Hades walked out into the corridor. He was older. Poggle had known this in the abstract years past, all creatures age. But he had not seen Hades up close in a long time, and the difference between knowing something and seeing it was significant. The Archduke's wings sat differently. His movements had the quality of something carefully managed rather than naturally confident. Hades looked at Poggle in the corridor. For a moment, something passed across the older creature's face. Not recognition exactly. Something more uncomfortable, the faint awareness of a thing you have chosen not to think about for a very long time. Then, it was gone. Hades walked past him without speaking. Poggle watched him go. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel grief. He felt something that had no clean name, the specific, cool sensation of a calculation that has been running in the background for decades, suddenly producing a result. Hades was not permanent. Nothing was permanent. And Poggle's waiting had always had a different quality than the waiting of someone with nowhere else to go. The new project orders came down 2 weeks later. A further expansion of the deep foundry network, a third phase, larger than the first 2 combined. Poggle was assigned to the structural planning team, as always, in a junior capacity. He arrived at the excavation site on the first morning and stood at the edge of the new dig area while the equipment was being positioned. The crew set up the resonance drill against the uncut rock face. The operator ran the calibration checks. The cutting head engaged, and then that moment, that half-second before the grinding started, the stone giving way, the single clean tone that lived only in the instant before everything became noise. Poggle stood very still and listened to it. The drones around him were already moving to their positions, already talking through the shift assignments, already looking at everything except what he was looking at. One of them glanced over at Poggle's expression and then looked away quickly, unable to read it and not particularly interested in trying. They would not have had the language for it, even if they had tried. It was the face of a creature who understood, with complete and quiet certainty, that the rock had no idea what was about to be built inside it. What was being constructed in those tunnels across all those years was not just a foundry. It was not just a network of off-world contacts or a private catalogue of uncredited work. It was a case assembled slowly, methodically, across decades for the argument that a verdict delivered at birth had been incorrect. The tunnels had taught him patience. They had taught him that systems, however solid they appear, are built by someone and can therefore be navigated by someone who has studied them long enough. What the tunnels had not taught him, what nothing in those warm amber corridors could have prepared him for, was what comes after you win the argument. The most damaging people in a life are rarely the ones who hate you. They are the ones who simply cannot see you, who look directly at what you are and register something less, not because they are cruel, not because they have decided to diminish you, but because the position they occupy has gradually made them unable to perceive certain things. Power does this quietly. It narrows the vision without the powerful person ever noticing the narrowing. Hades the Vaulted was not a monster. That is the hardest part of this chapter to hold on to, because it would be easier if he were. The first time Hades asked for Poggle's professional opinion, Poggle was 41 years old. The request came through an administrative aide, a summons to the upper chambers, framed as a technical consultation. Poggle arrived, stood in the large meeting room that smelled of processed resin and old stone, and found Hades seated at the head of a wide table covered in construction schematics. The Archduke was reviewing plans for a new ore extraction facility in the hive's northern sector. There was a problem with the proposed shaft alignment. The angle being used would intersect with a geological fault line approximately 80 meters down. Anyone who knew the northern sector's subsurface composition would have seen it immediately. Hades gestured at the plans. "Tell me what you see." Poggle looked at the schematics for about 30 seconds. Then he explained the fault line issue, described the specific depth at which the intersection would occur, and outlined 3 alternative shaft angles that would avoid the problem entirely. He ranked them by cost and extraction efficiency. He did this in under 4 minutes. Hades listened. He nodded at the correct intervals. He asked 2 follow-up questions that showed he had understood the core of what Poggle was saying. Then he thanked Poggle, dismissed him, and 3 days later approved the original shaft alignment, with a minor modification suggested by the senior geological officer, a modification that did not address the fault line problem, and would, 8 years later, cause a partial shaft collapse that shut down the northern extraction operation for 6 months. Poggle was not consulted on the collapse investigation. He already knew what they would find. This became the pattern. Not always, not every time. Hades was not consistent enough in his errors to make the pattern feel like policy. Sometimes he took Poggle's assessments and used them directly. Sometimes he overrode them with inferior solutions for reasons that were never explained. The inconsistency was, in certain ways, worse than simple dismissal would have been, because it meant Poggle could never quite stop hoping that this consultation might be the one that actually changed something. Hope, in that specific form, is a very efficient way to keep someone in place. The hive read Poggle's continued service as loyalty. The senior administrators who observed his quiet compliance with decisions he clearly disagreed with assumed this was a junior architect understanding his position and accepting it gracefully. They noted it favorably in his personnel records. They had entirely misread what they were observing. What they were watching was not acceptance. It was study. Every time Hades made a decision that contradicted Poggle's recommendation, Poggle filed the outcome away, not with bitterness, on tour, but with the attentiveness of someone building a comprehensive map of how a particular kind of authority fails. He was learning, in exhaustive detail, every way that the Archduke's position protected him from the consequences of his own limitations. This was, in its own way, the most advanced education the Hive ever gave him. The off-world visits were a different kind of lesson. Several times a year, the Stalgassan Hive received delegations from trade partners, corporate interests, and political representatives from across the Outer Rim. These visits followed a fixed structure. The guests were received in the upper administrative chambers. They were given a tour of the Hive's major facilities. They were presented with the Hive's production achievements as evidence of Stalgassan power and reliability. Hadis conducted these tours personally. He was good at them. He had a formal authority that translated well across species, the kind of presence that made visitors feel they were dealing with someone significant. He knew the numbers. He could speak fluently about production volumes, expansion timelines, technical capabilities. What he almost never did, across all those tours and all those delegations, was mention a name other than his own. The foundry that processed ore at 3 times the previous rate, Hadis described the engineering decisions that produced it as collective Hive achievement. The drainage system that had kept the lower levels dry for decades the same. The arena with its precisely calibrated foundation columns. Hadis walked guests through it and spoke about Geonosian construction tradition as though the specific genius of the place had grown organically from the rock itself. Poggle attended some of these tours in his capacity as technical support, available to answer detailed questions that the Archduke preferred not to be caught unable to answer. He stood at the back of the group. He answered questions when directed to. He watched Hadis describe work that Poggle had done and felt, each time, the same thing. Not anger. Something colder and more clarifying than anger. The confirmation of something he had suspected for a long time, but had not yet seen proven so completely. The succession conversation happened in the 47th year of Poggle's life. It was not a formal meeting. It occurred at the end of a project review, one of the rare occasions when it was just the 2 of them in a room, the administrative aides having been dismissed and the documentation already filed. Hadis was looking over the final summary of a completed tunnel expansion. He seemed, in that particular hour, more relaxed than usual, less managed. Something about the completed paperwork and the empty room had taken some of the performance out of him. He said, without looking up from the summary, "You have been with the guild a long time." "Yes," Poggle said. "The work has been consistent." Hadis set the summary down. The Hive values consistency. Poggle waited. There was clearly more coming. "I want to expand the deep foundry network again," Hadis continued. "3rd phase, larger than the first 2. I intend to begin planning in the next cycle." He looked up then. "I will need the structural division fully committed for the next several years." He paused. "I mention this because I know there are sometimes questions about continuity of leadership, future arrangements." He said the next part, "The way you say something you have decided to say precisely, because you have decided not to say more than this. I am in good health. I expect to remain so. The Hive is stable. There is no urgency around those questions." He picked up the summary again. "I wanted you to be aware of the timeline." The room was quiet for a moment. Poggle said, "I understand." He said it evenly, without weight. "The way you confirm that a message has been received." Hadis nodded and returned to the document in his hands. What he had just communicated, in the careful language of Geonosian authority, was this: "Do not wait for my position. You will be waiting a long time. The foundry needs your attention. Stay where you are. What Poggle heard, in the silence underneath those words, was something Hadis had not intended to communicate at all. He heard a creature who had just felt the need to say this out loud. And creatures who are completely secure do not feel that need. There was one Geonosian in the lower guild levels who understood what Poggle was. His name was Kree, a master foundry engineer, 3 decades Poggle's senior, who had spent his entire working life in the deep levels and had developed, over that time, the specific perceptiveness of someone who has observed a great deal while being observed by almost no one. He was not Poggle's friend. The word does not quite fit the relationship. Geonosian hive culture does not produce friendship in the way other species understand it. What existed between them was something rarer and more durable, the recognition of one particular mind by another, without any need to discuss what was being recognized. Kree never complimented Poggle's work directly. He did not need to. He communicated through a different system the specific way he positioned himself near Poggle's designs during reviews. The questions he asked that were slightly more precise than the questions anyone else thought to ask. The occasions when he was the one who noticed an error in someone else's modification of Poggle's original solution and corrected it without attribution or commentary. Once, and only once, he said something that functioned as an acknowledgement of everything neither of them talked about. They were in the lower foundry at the end of a shift. Most of the other workers had already left. Kree was reviewing the next day's work orders. Poggle was finishing a calculation at the adjacent surface. Without looking up from the work orders, Kree said, "The third phase expansion is going to need someone who understands what's actually underneath the northern sector. Most of them don't." He said nothing else. He filed the work orders and walked out. Poggle sat with that sentence for a long time after the older engineer had gone. It was the closest thing to "I see you" that the system they both lived inside had room for. Kree did not survive the Clone Wars. He was in the lower foundry network during the Second Republic assault on Geonosis. The structural damage from the bombardment reached the deep levels. His name does not appear in any post-war documentation. The hive's records from that period are fragmentary. He simply is not in them anymore. The moment that came closest to changing everything happened in Poggle's 53rd year. Hadis had been increasingly unwell, nothing that had been formally announced, but visible to anyone paying attention in the specific way that Poggle always paid attention. The older creature's decision-making had slowed. The administrative aides were more frequently in his chambers. The gap between when a question was asked and when an answer was produced had grown. On a particular afternoon, Poggle passed Hadis in one of the upper corridor junctions. This was not unusual. Their paths crossed occasionally in the administrative levels. Normally, Hadis acknowledged him with the brief, functional nod of a superior passing a junior whose name he knows but whose face he has stopped truly seeing. This time was different. Hadis stopped. He looked at Poggle, not past him, not through him, but at him, with an attention that was different in quality from anything Poggle had experienced from him before. Something in the older creature's expression had the texture of a thought arriving late, of a calculation running slowly that should have been completed a long time ago. He looked at Poggle for what felt like a significant interval. Then the moment passed. Whatever had opened in Hadis's expression closed again. He nodded the normal nod, the functional one, and continued down the corridor. Poggle stood in the junction and watched him go. He had seen something in that look. He could not have named it precisely, but he recognized its shape, the shape of a being who has almost understood something they have been not understanding for a very long time. Almost. It had not been enough, and Hadis had continued walking, and the corridor had absorbed him, and the moment had no sequel. The morning it happened was ordinary in every visible way. The amber light came through the upper rock faces the same way it always did, that permanent late afternoon quality, the ring-scattered glow that made every Geonosian morning look like the tail end of something. The lower foundry was already running when Poggle arrived at his workstation. He could hear it from 3 levels, up the specific low vibration of the smelting operation that had become so familiar over the decades that silence would have felt wrong. He sat down at his drafting surface. He reviewed the current project specifications. He made 3 corrections to a calculation that a junior draftsman had submitted the previous evening. He requested a revised materials estimate from the supply coordinator. It was, from any external perspective, a day indistinguishable from several thousand days before it. Somewhere in the upper chambers, Hadis the Vaulted went through the last hours of his life. Whether it was sudden or slow, whether there was pain or the absence of it, whether anyone was with him or the room was quiet, none of this is in any record that has survived. The Hive's documentation of the event is clinical and brief. The Archduke died. The succession procedures were initiated. What is also not in the record is what Poggle was doing at the precise moment it occurred. He was at his drafting surface. He was working. The foundry was running below him. The amber light was doing what it always did. Nothing in the physical world marked the moment. The following day, the rival hive lords convened, and everything Poggle had built, the private catalog, the off-world network, the decades of patience, the map of every failure in the system that had kept him in place. Everything came into a new relationship with time. Not yet useful, not yet deployed, but no longer waiting for the same thing. Something closed between that morning and the day that followed. Not a door. Doors can be reopened, walked back through, pretended past. Something more permanent than a door. The last version of Poggle, who might have been satisfied with the work itself, with the tunnels and the designs and the quiet private catalogue of things he had built and never owned, that version went still. It did not leave in anger. It did not make a sound. It simply stopped moving, the way water stops moving when the temperature drops below a certain point. What remained was not different in appearance. It used the same face, the same workstation, the same careful silence in meetings, but the thing underneath had changed its state entirely. And states, once changed that completely, do not change back. Nobody announced what happened to Hadis. That is the first thing to understand. There was no declaration, no formal accusation, no moment where someone stood in a chamber and said the word that everyone in the upper levels of the Stargassen hive was already thinking. The hive lords who gathered in the days following the Archduke's death were too careful for that. They had lived inside political structures long enough to know that the most dangerous thing you can do with a suspicion is speak it before you can prove it. So they did not speak it. They simply began asking questions. The succession process in Geonosian hive tradition was old and detailed and, under normal circumstances, relatively straightforward. The Archduke's heir presented ancestral documentation. The assembled lords reviewed the lineage claims. Objections were registered through formal channels. A vote was held. The transition was completed. Under normal circumstances, what made these circumstances different was a quality in the air of the proceedings that everyone present could feel and no one could formally name. The questions the lords asked were precise and carefully worded. They concerned timelines when certain decisions had been made, who had been present, what the Archduke's condition had been in his final weeks. They concerned access who had been in the upper chambers during certain periods, which administrative routes passed through which corridors. They were not asking Poggle directly. They were building a picture from the edges inward. Poggle sat through every session of the proceedings with the same expression he brought to project reviews: attentive, composed, giving away nothing that had not already been decided to give. He answered the questions he was asked. He did not volunteer information beyond what was requested. He did not confess. He did not deny. He simply provided nothing that could be built into a case. The lords were experienced. They recognized what they were looking at. A creature who has been careful does not look innocent, they look careful. And careful, in the context of a dead Archduke and a very convenient timing, was its own kind of answer. It was not enough to act on. It was enough to decide on. The exile order came on the 9th day. It was framed, in the official documentation, as a precautionary measure pending further review of the succession circumstances. The language was administrative and bloodless. It did not use the word guilty. It did not need to. What it said, in practical terms, was this: Poggle the Lesser was removed from all hive positions and titles. He was given 3 days to collect personal effects. He was escorted to the outer transit point by hive security, and then he was outside the boundary of Geonosis's orbital jurisdiction on a transport heading into the outer rim, with a name that had always meant not enough and now carried an additional layer of meaning that required no translation. Suspect. He sat in the transport's rear passenger section and watched Geonosis reduce through the viewport. The amber color of it, that specific ring-scattered light he had looked up at from the lower tunnels. His entire life faded as the transport gained distance. The planet did not look significant from out here. It looked like what it was: a dry, rocky body in a distant system that most of the galaxy had no particular reason to think about. He watched it until it was gone. Then he turned away from the viewport and began making a list in his head of every off-world contact he still had access to. A Geonosian removed from the hive is not simply a creature in a new location. The hive is not a workplace or a community in the way other species use those words. It is closer to a nervous system, something the individual body is connected to at a level below conscious thought. The collective awareness, the low persistent sense of others nearby, the specific comfort of existing inside a shared purpose, all of it is simply present, the way temperature is present, the way the sound of the foundry had always been present in the rock beneath Poggle's feet. In Exile, it stopped. The silence that replaced it was not peaceful. It was the silence of an amputation, not painful in any way Poggle could have pointed to, just absent. A register of experience that had always been occupied was now empty, and the emptiness had a physical quality, like pressure in the chest, that no amount of breathing resolved. He did not speak about this to anyone. He was not certain there was language for it that a non-Geonosian would have understood. He moved through the first months of exile, the way an injured creature moves through terrain it needs to cross steadily, without drawing attention to the injury, conserving effort for what actually mattered. The outer rim, during this period of the Republic's long decline, was a particular kind of place. Not lawless, exactly. Laws existed everywhere in the Outer Rim. They were simply laws written by whoever currently held the most leverage in a given system. Corporate interests, regional crime organizations, planetary governments of varying stability, all of them maintaining their own versions of order over territories that Coruscant had either not reached or had reached and then quietly abandoned. For a creature moving through this landscape with professional skills and no official affiliation, the Outer Rim offered something the Hive's attribution system never had: direct payment. Poggle spent his first year in Exile doing contract consultation work, the same structural and manufacturing analysis he had done privately through Lokdara's network, now expanded and accelerated. He was not difficult to find for those who knew what to look for. Word moved through trade networks the way water moves through rock slowly, finding every available channel. An architect, Geonosian, exceptional precision, available for private engagement. The work was good. It covered his costs and built his reserves and kept his mind occupied with problems that had solutions. It did not replace what was missing. He slept badly in the early months. Not from guilt, this needs to be said clearly, because it would be easy to assume guilt and wrong to do so. He slept badly because the Hive absence had a nocturnal intensity that the activity of working hours suppressed but could not eliminate. In the dark, in whatever bunk or transit berth or rented room he occupied on whatever station or outpost he had reached, the emptiness in that missing register was loudest. He developed a practice during those nights. He would find a surface, a wall, a floor, a table, and drag one finger slowly across it in a long, deliberate line, not drawing anything, just the gesture, the motion of beginning, the first scratch, with nothing to build and no one watching. It helped slightly. He could not have explained why. He encountered the Separatist movement the way you encounter weather, not through a single event, but through a gradual accumulation of signs that something large was forming in the atmosphere. The first sign was a shift in the tone of conversations at the trade stations and corporate depots where his consultation work took him. The complaints about Republic taxation had always been present in Outer Rim business circles. They were background noise, as constant and unremarkable as the hum of station life support. But the complaints were acquiring structure. They were beginning to reference each other. People who had never met were using the same framing, the same examples, the same language. Someone was providing that language. The second sign was more concrete. A manufacturing consortium on Eriadu contracted Poggle for a facility assessment standard work, nothing unusual. But the facility he was brought in to assess was producing at a scale that did not match the consortium's official output declarations. The gap between what the factory was making and what it was reporting to Republic trade authorities was significant, and the components being manufactured in the gap were not consumer goods. They were military chassis components. Poggle completed his assessment, delivered his report, accepted his payment, and asked no questions. But he noted what he had seen. The third sign was a meeting. It was arranged through 3 intermediaries, which told him before he arrived that whoever had requested it understood how to move carefully through the kinds of channels Poggle used. He was brought to a private room on a station whose name he was asked not to record anywhere. The person waiting for him was not Count Dooku. That introduction would come later. It was a representative, a Muon from the banking clan's outer operations division, with a manner that communicated significant authority held at deliberate remove. The representative did not explain what was being assembled. He described it only in terms of what it needed. A manufacturing infrastructure capable of producing military hardware at a scale the Republic could not match. Located in systems outside Republic jurisdiction, reliable, expandable, operational, within a time frame that the representative described as urgent. He asked whether Poggle could speak to the question of what such an infrastructure would require. Poggle could. He spoke for 40 minutes. He described, from memory, the full scope of what the Geonosian foundry network was capable of producing, what modifications would be required to shift it from standard hive output to dedicated military manufacturing, what the timeline would look like, and what the arrangement would need to offer in return. The last part was what the meeting had actually been called to discuss. Poggle did not ask for money. He had enough money. He did not ask for safety or protection or any of the things that people in difficult circumstances typically ask for first. He asked to go home. The moon representative was quiet for a moment. Then he said that this was, he believed, an arrangeable matter. Poggle said he would need that in writing, through channels that could be verified, before any further conversation took place. The representative said he would make the necessary contacts. The meeting ended. He was on that station for 6 more days before the next communication arrived. During those days, he did not review the conversation or second-guess it, or spend time in the territory of what it meant about who he was becoming. He had already covered that territory. He had covered it in the long nights of the first Exile months, in the dark, dragging his finger across whatever surface was nearby. He knew what he was willing to do. He had known for some time. On the 4th evening, he was sitting in the station's outer observation area, a cramped space with a scratched transparasteel panel looking out at nothing in particular, a stretch of outer rim space with no nearby bodies worth looking at. The surface of the panel was dusty. Station maintenance on a facility this size never quite reached the peripheral areas. He sat there for a while without moving. Then he raised one wingtip and drew it slowly across the dust on the transparasteel, a long line. No particular shape, just the gesture, the beginning of something that had no plan yet, on a surface that would never become anything. He looked at the line for a moment. Outside the panel, the outer rim went on in every direction without comment. The communication arrived on the 6th day. It confirmed what the representative had described as arrangeable. The details were specific enough to be credible and vague enough to require a follow-on meeting to complete. Poggle read it twice. Then he sent a reply, confirming his continued interest. Then he began drafting in his head the full scope of what the Geonosian foundry network would need to become. He had been designing it for years, without knowing he was designing it. All those private catalogs, all those uncredited solutions, all those decades of understanding the hive's production capacity better than anyone who actually ran it, all of it now had a direction, not a use. A direction. The difference mattered to him, though he could not have explained why to anyone who asked. He was not doing this for the Separatists. He was not doing it for ideology or justice, or the long list of legitimate grievances that Count Dooku was assembling into a political coalition. He was doing it to go home, and once he was home, he intended to make sure he was never removed from it again. The thing about Exile is that it removes every distraction between a person and their own clarity. The hive noise, the daily routines, the accumulated small accommodations of a life lived inside a system, all of it falls away, and what remains is simply the person in the dark, on a surface that is not theirs, in a place that does not know their name. Poggle spent years in that condition. And when he came back out of it, when the arrangement was made and the path home became visible, he came back, having answered every question he had ever hesitated over. Not because Exile had hardened him, because it had clarified him. He returned having already made every decision he would need to make for the rest of his life. He simply had not yet had occasion to act on all of them. He had been back on Geonosis for 14 months when the Republic came. 14 months of restoration. of walking through foundry sections he had designed from memory during the Exile years and finding them exactly as he had calculated. They would be the load tolerances, holding the ventilation patterns moving correctly, the drainage channels clear. 14 months of the hive's collective presence returning in his chest like warmth, returning to a limb that had gone cold for too long. Not comfortable, exactly, not simple, but present again. Real again. 14 months. And then the sky changed. The morning of the first battle began like every other morning on Geonosis. The amber light came through the ring system at its usual angle. The foundries were already running. They ran continuously now. 3 shifts, no pause, producing the droid components that the Separatist war machine required in volumes that would have been unimaginable under the old hive administration. The air in the upper levels carried the specific combination of processed metal and rock dust that had become, since his return, the smell Poggle associated with things being as they should be. He was in the command center of the primary foundry complex when the first alert came through. Not a dramatic alert. A quiet one. A signal from the orbital monitoring network indicating vessel movement in the outer approaches that did not match any registered Separatist traffic. He looked at the signal for a moment. Then he began issuing orders. What followed was not a battle. From where Poggle stood, battles are experienced differently depending on where you are inside them. For the Jedi who descended into the arena that morning, for the clone troopers who followed, for the gunships that swept low over the ring-lit surface, it was a fight with clear geometry. Positions held and lost, objectives taken, an enemy pushed back and then routed. For Poggle, standing in the Foundry Command Center, as the alerts multiplied and the communication channels filled with fragmented reports, it was something with no geometry at all. It was sound first. The Foundry absorbed vibration from the surface bombardment before any visual confirmation arrived, a deep, irregular shuddering that moved through the rock, the way a fault shift moves, not violent but vast. The sensation of something large happening at a distance that the stone was faithfully transmitting. Workers paused. Machinery continued. The smelting operations did not distinguish between ordinary operation and catastrophe. They simply ran, because no one had yet issued the order to stop them. Then the visual feeds came through. Republic gunships over the Petranaki arena. Clone formations moving across the surface in organized columns. Fighter craft in the upper atmosphere, cutting through the ring-scattered amber light in patterns that left trails of disturbed air visible from the ground. Poggle watched the feeds with the same expression he had brought to every project review for 50 years. Still, attentive, giving nothing away. Inside that stillness, something was happening that had no name in any language he had ever learned. The hive mind registered the deaths before the command structure did. This is the part that has no clean explanation for anyone who has not experienced Geonosian collective consciousness firsthand. The individual drone does not receive a notification when another drone dies. There is no signal, no transmission, no moment of received information. It is more like a texture change, the way a fabric changes when threads are removed from it. You do not feel the individual thread going. You feel the fabric becoming different, thinner, lighter, in a way that is not comfortable. In the first hours of the battle, the fabric changed very quickly. Poggle felt it while he was issuing evacuation orders for the secondary foundry complex. He felt it while he was reviewing the escape route calculations. He felt it while he was walking at a controlled pace through the lower corridors toward the extraction point where his transport was being prepared. He did not stop moving. He did not change his pace. He gave no outward indication that anything beyond tactical withdrawal was occurring. But the thinning was constant, and it was rapid, and it was in a register of experience that his years in exile had made him acutely sensitive to, because he had felt its absence so completely for so long that its presence had become something he was aware of, the way you are aware of your own breathing, unconsciously, continuously, only noticing when something changes. It was changing now, continuously, in one direction. He reached the transport. He did not look back at the foundry complex as the craft lifted. He had made a private rule about this: looking back at things you cannot affect is a waste of attention that could be spent on what comes next. But when the transport broke through the upper atmosphere, and the surface of Geonosis became visible in its full geography below the ring system, the amber-colored rock, the irregular columns of the surface formations casting their geometrically unlikely shadows, he did look then, just for a moment, from a distance at which the individual structures were too small to distinguish. He had looked at Geonosis from this angle once before, on a transport heading in the other direction, under different circumstances. The planet looked the same. He turned away and began drafting the damage assessment report. The period between the two battles lasted approximately a year. In the official record, this is described as a time of Separatist retrenchment and Geonosian reconstruction. Both descriptions are accurate, and neither one is adequate. What it felt like, from inside it, was this. The foundry network had to be rebuilt from approximately 40% of its pre-battle capacity. Some of the damage was from Republic bombardment. Some was from the hasty evacuation procedures, machinery shut down incorrectly, systems left in states that caused secondary failures after the immediate crisis passed. Some was simply from the pace of wartime production that had preceded the battle equipment, pushed beyond its maintenance tolerances because the delivery schedules left no room for downtime. Poggle oversaw the reconstruction with the same systematic attention he had given to every large-scale project of his career. He was on site more than any administrative protocol required. He walked the damaged sections personally. He made decisions that should have been delegated because he did not fully trust that anyone else's assessment of structural integrity matched his own. This was not arrogance. It was the specific anxiety of someone who has watched things he built become rubble and does not intend to watch it happen to the rebuilt versions for the same preventable reasons. The foundries came back online in phases. Each phase felt like recovery. Each phase also felt, underneath the recovery, like preparation for something that had not announced itself yet, but was already decided. The war had not gone the way the Separatist strategists had projected in those early organizational meetings. The Republic's clone army had mobilized faster than anticipated. The Jedi had adapted to military command with an effectiveness that the Confederacy's models had underestimated. The battles across the Outer Rim were not going uniformly in either direction, but the pattern underneath the individual engagements had a shape that Poggle could read the way he read structural surveys. The weight was not distributed evenly. And unevenly distributed weight, given sufficient time, always finds the same destination. The drones were the part that accumulated without announcement. Not in any single event. Not in any battle significant enough to appear in the major records of the war. They went in the small operations, the skirmishes around the foundry perimeters, the orbital engagements that the history would compress into single sentences, the accidents of wartime production that claimed workers, the way wartime production always claims workers, quietly and in numbers that only become visible when you look at the total rather than any individual instance. The hive fabric kept changing. Poggle kept working. He did not hold formal acknowledgement ceremonies. Geonosian tradition did not include them in the way other cultures did. The hive did not pause for individual losses because the hive did not experience loss as individual. It experienced it as collective diminishment, as the slow revision of what the group was capable of, as a recalibration of resources and roles and the interlocking dependencies that made the network function. He recalibrated. He redistributed responsibilities. He adjusted production targets to match the actual workforce rather than the projected one. He redesigned several assembly line configurations to require fewer operators without reducing output. Every adjustment was technically correct. Every adjustment was also a measurement of how much had been lost. He performed these measurements with complete professional accuracy and stored the Geonosian cost of each number, in a part of his awareness that he did not examine directly while he was working. There was no time to examine it directly. There was always another adjustment required. There was a foundry in the northwestern sector that Poggle had designed during the Reconstruction period as a personal priority. It was not the largest facility in the network, nor the highest capacity producer. It was significant to him for a different reason. It had been built on the site of the original deep foundry, Kree's foundry, the one where Poggle had spent the most formative years of his professional life, the one whose ventilation system had been his first major uncredited contribution. The original structure had been destroyed in the bombardment of the first battle. What Poggle rebuilt on that site was not a replica. He had no interest in replicas. It was a new facility, more efficient than the original, better suited to the current production requirements. But the foundation columns were positioned at the same intervals as the old ones, not because the engineering required it. The new facility's structural needs were different. He positioned them there anyway. He did not document his reasoning in the project specifications. The silence before the second battle arrived differently than the silence before the first. Before the first battle, the silence had been the silence of a world that did not yet know what was coming. A working silence. The silence of foundries running and drones moving through their shifts, and the ordinary business of production filling every available hour. The silence before the second battle was the silence of a world that had already been through one catastrophe and had rebuilt and kept working, and was now standing at the edge of another with the specific, heavy awareness of something that has learned what falling feels like. The foundries were running. The drones were at their stations. The orbital monitoring network was active, and the Separatist defense positions were manned, and every preparation that could be made had been made. But the quality of the sound was different. Underneath the machinery, underneath the production noise and the communication traffic, and all the ordinary sounds of a world that had refused to stop functioning, there was something that had not been there before the first battle. Not fear. Geonosian collective consciousness does not map cleanly onto fear as other species experience it. Something more like knowledge. The hive knew, in the way a structure knows where its stress points are, that what was coming would test tolerances that the reconstruction had not fully restored. The fabric of the collective was thinner than it had been before the first engagement. The threads that had been removed in the intervening year had not been replaced. They could not be replaced on any timeline the war had allowed for. Poggle stood at the observation point of the primary foundry complex on the last night before the Republic fleet was detected in the approach corridors. The amber light of the ring system was doing what it always did, making the hour look later than it was, making the sky look like the end of something. He looked at the surface of his world. The foundries behind him ran without pause. Below and around and throughout everything he had built and rebuilt, the hive moved through the last ordinary hours of a period that would not be recovered. He listened to the sound of it. He had always been better than anyone at listening to things others had stopped hearing. The second battle was louder than the first in every measurable way. More vessels, more ground forces, more points of engagement across the surface simultaneously. The noise of it reached registers that the rock itself had never been asked to absorb before. But noise fades. Sound disperses. What does not disperse, what the survivors carried with them into every year that followed, was not any specific moment of the battle itself. It was the silence afterward. The particular quality of a world that had been full of a particular kind of sound for so long that the absence of it became its own presence. The foundries that no longer ran, the sections of the hive network that no longer had enough occupants to require operation, the specific, irreversible thinning of something that had taken generations to build and days to reduce to its surviving fraction. That silence had weight. It had temperature. It had the specific texture of a loss that is too large to be held in any individual experience, and so simply becomes the air. The catacombs beneath Geonosis were older than the hive. Not older than Geonosians, older than the organized structure that the word hive implies. They had been carved across centuries by workers whose names were not recorded, whose individual contributions were absorbed into the collective project the way water is absorbed into stone, slowly, completely, without remainder. The passages ran deeper than the foundry network, deeper than the drainage systems, deeper than the oldest tunnel expansions, deeper than any of the infrastructure Poggle had spent his life building above them. They were not maintained in any regular sense. They were simply present, a geological fact of the lower Geonosian strata, carved and then left to the specific stillness of spaces that are too far from ordinary life to require attention. The air down there was different, not the iron and dust combination of the working tunnels. Something older than that, a mineral quality that had nothing to do with current operations, the smell of rock that had been enclosed for so long it had developed its own internal atmosphere, cool, perfectly still, the kind of air that makes sound behave differently, absorbing it rather than carrying it, so that even a voice raised to normal speaking volume seems to travel only a short distance before the stone takes it. Count Dooku had chosen this location carefully. Poggle had met Dooku 3 times before this particular meeting. The first time had been in the organizational period, before the Separatist coalition formally announced itself. The meeting of principles that established what each party was bringing to the arrangement and what each expected to receive. Dooku had been precise and unhurried in a way that reminded Poggle uncomfortably of Hades. Not in character, the two creatures could not have been more different in what they actually were, but in manner. The specific manner of someone who has occupied a position of authority long enough that the performance of it has become indistinguishable from the reality. The second meeting had been after the first battle of Geonosis, a brief communication, largely logistical, concerning the pace of foundry reconstruction and the revised production commitments the Separatist military command required. The third had been a longer strategic session covering the war's second year. At none of these meetings had Dooku mentioned the project. He mentioned it now. He produced the documents without introduction. A data cylinder, the kind used for large technical files, handed across the stone table that 2 Geonosian workers had carried down to the catacomb chamber 3 days earlier for this specific purpose. Poggle accepted it, connected it to his portable reader, and looked at what was inside. The design was early. Anyone who understood large-scale construction could see that immediately the proportions were established, the basic architecture decided, but the engineering specifics were still at the stage of being proposed rather than solved. Hundreds of technical questions had been noted in the margins of the file and left open. The structural load calculations for the outer shell were placeholder figures. The power generation requirements were listed as estimated ranges rather than precise specifications. But the overall shape of the thing was clear. You could not look at it and misunderstand what it was for. Poggle looked at it for a long time without speaking. He moved through the file at his own pace, section by section, the way he reviewed every set of plans not linearly, but by structure. Starting with the load-bearing elements, moving to the system's dependencies, checking the relationship between the stated purpose and the proposed engineering. The stated purpose was not written anywhere in the document. It did not need to be. Poggle had spent his professional life understanding what structures were designed to do by reading how they were built. This one was designed to do one thing. The scale of the power systems, the specific geometry of the primary focusing array, the reinforcement architecture around the central axis, all of it had only one coherent explanation. It was designed to end something at the level of planets. Dooku watched him read without speaking. He had the patience of someone who has done this before, who has presented something significant to someone significant, and learned to let the silence do its work. Poggle did not look up from the reader. He said, "The external plating calculations are wrong." Pause. "Show me," Dooku said. Poggle found the error in the third subsection of the structural engineering file. The plating thickness specified for the outer shell assumed a uniform material composition that did not account for the thermal variation between the weapon's active and dormant states. At the temperatures the power systems would generate during firing cycles, the specified material would develop microfractures along the seam junctions within a relatively small number of operational uses. It was not a catastrophic error. The weapon would function, but it would degrade faster than the designers had projected, and the degradation would be uneven. And uneven degradation in a structure operating at these energy levels was the kind of problem that compounded. He explained this in precise, plain language. He pulled up the relevant subsections. He walked Dooku through the numbers without editorializing, without framing, without any language that was not strictly technical. Dooku listened. When Poggle finished, Dooku said, "Can it be corrected at this stage?" "Yes," Poggle said. "It is easier to correct now than after the primary architecture is committed." He pulled up the notation function on the reader. He made the correction to the plating specification directly in the file, a precise adjustment. 4 lines of revised calculation that resolved the thermal variance problem without requiring any change to the overall design. He looked at the corrected section for a moment. Then he closed the file and handed the data cylinder back across the table. He had just made the Death Star more viable. He knew this. He did not look away from it. He simply held it in the same part of his awareness where he held all the other precise things he knew about his own actions, and he handed the cylinder back, and he waited to hear what Dooku would say next. What Dooku said next was logistical. The file needed to reach a specific location through channels that could not be traced back to Geonosis. Poggle confirmed that the Separatist courier network had routes that satisfied this requirement. They discussed the timeline for the next phase of design development. They discussed what resources from the Geonosian Technical Division might be made available for consultation on the unresolved engineering questions in the file. The conversation was professional. It covered what it needed to cover. It lasted approximately 40 minutes. Then Dooku left the catacomb chamber with the data cylinder, and Poggle was alone in the deep stone air with the portable reader and the table, and the absolute silence of a space that absorbed sound rather than carrying it. He sat there for a while. He was not processing guilt. This needs to be said directly because it would be easy to read the stillness that followed as remorse, and it was not remorse. Poggle did not operate in the register of remorse. He operated in the register of precision of understanding exactly what had occurred and storing it accurately, without softening, without the distorting pressure of wishing it were different. What had occurred was this: he had reviewed a design for a weapon capable of ending planets, identified a flaw in its construction, corrected the flaw, and returned it to the person who was going to build it. He held this fact the same way he held every fact about his own actions, completely, without looking away. Then he gathered his things and walked back up through the catacombs toward the foundry levels. In the weeks that followed, no one who worked with Poggle observed any change in him. This is not surprising. The changes were not the kind that observation captures. They were not behavioral in any obvious sense. He arrived at the same time, worked the same hours, made the same quality of decisions with the same efficient precision. He spoke no more and no less than he typically did in project meetings. But there were three things that the people around him might have noticed if they had been watching with the specific attention that Poggle himself brought to the world. The first was the roots. The catacomb entrance nearest to the primary foundry complex was accessible through two different corridor junctions. Before the meeting with Dooku, Poggle had used whichever junction was closest to his current location, a purely practical choice, the kind made without conscious thought. After the meeting, he consistently used the junction that required a longer path, not dramatically longer, perhaps 40 additional steps each way, but consistent, every time, for weeks. He was not avoiding the catacombs. He had no reason to avoid them, and would have identified avoidance as an irrational response if he had caught himself doing it. He was simply taking longer to get there. The second was the first scratch. The gesture had been part of every project he had initiated since his earliest years in the guild. It had never taken more than a moment. The wingtip dragged across the surface. The beginning marked. The work commenced. In the weeks after the catacomb meeting, the gesture took slightly longer. Not dramatically. A fraction of a second. The kind of difference that would not register in any practical assessment of his working habits. But it was there. A hesitation so brief it barely deserved the name. At the precise moment between the decision to begin and the actual beginning. The third was the way he looked at the drones. Not all the time, not in any way that disrupted the normal operation of the working shifts. But occasionally, when a group of workers moved through a construction area together, when the lower foundry corridors filled with the shift-change movement of a large crew, when the collective presence of the hive concentrated in a space in a way that made it briefly, intensely tangible, Poggle would pause in whatever he was doing and watch. Not with sentiment, not with anything that could be identified as emotional response. With the specific attentiveness of someone trying to accurately record something before the opportunity to record it passes. The narrator cannot say what he was recording. The narrator cannot say whether Poggle himself knew. There was a sound that the deep rock of Geonosis made when the temperature differential between the surface and the lower strata shifted, which happened twice each Geonosian day. At the transition between the ring-lit period and the relative dark of the far orbital hours, the rock expanded and contracted in response to the thermal change, and the movement produced a sound that was not quite a creak and not quite a groan, something between the two. A slow, structural, settling. The noise of enormous weight redistributing itself by fractions across a body of stone that had been performing this same adjustment since long before the hive existed. Most Geonosians who worked in the deep levels had stopped hearing it years into their assignments. It became background. It became part of the definition of silence down there. The way the foundry vibration was part of the definition of silence in the working tunnels, present so constantly that the auditory system learned to classify it as absence. Poggle had never stopped hearing it. On an evening approximately 3 weeks after the catacomb meeting, he walked to the entrance of the deepest hive chamber, the lowest accessible point of the entire Stalgazin complex, below even the foundry network. At the level where the carved passages gave way to natural geological formation, he stood at the threshold. He did not enter, he simply stood at the point where the constructed world ended and the unmodified rock began. He waited. The thermal shift came. The stone began its adjustment. The sound moved through the chamber entrance, that slow, deep settling, traveling up from depths that no construction project had ever reached, produced by weight and time and the indifferent physics of planetary geology. He listened to it. He did not move. He did not look away. He gave it the full attention he had always given to sounds that others had stopped registering. The settling continued for perhaps 2 minutes. Then it faded. Then it was gone, absorbed back into the baseline silence of the deep stone. Poggle stood at the threshold for a moment after it ended. Then he turned and walked back up toward the foundry levels, where the work was waiting, where it was always waiting, where it had been waiting his entire life, and showed no indication of stopping. The entrance to the deep chamber was behind him. He did not look back at it. Somewhere above and across and throughout the levels, he moved through on his way back to the work surface, in the collective fabric of the hive's shared awareness, in the specific texture of the consciousness that connected every drone and worker and administrator in the Stalgazin network. Something continued that Poggle had no instrument to measure and no language to accurately describe. The hive did not know about the catacomb meeting. The hive did not know about the data cylinder or the correction to the plating specifications or the design that was now traveling toward the people who would eventually build it into something the galaxy had never seen before. The hive simply continued, running its shifts, operating its foundries, moving through the amber-lit tunnels in the groups and flows and patterns of collective purpose that had defined Geonosian life since before any current member of it had been born. Poggle walked back through it toward his workstation. The foundries ran. The stone settled. The distance between the decision and its consequences remained, for now, too large to see across. There are choices that do not arrive with the feeling of choosing. They arrive with the feeling of recognition, the sense that this was always what was going to happen, that the sequence of every prior decision was pointing here, that a particular kind of person in a particular kind of position does not actually have the range of options that a different kind of person might imagine they have. Poggle left the catacombs, and the plans remained with Dooku, and the correction he had made to the plating specifications traveled with them, folded into the design as if it had always been there. The foundries kept running above and around and below everything. They always kept running. That was the one constant in all of it, not the war, not the politics, not the decisions that would unspool their consequences across decades. The foundries, moving, producing. The sound of the thing he had built, continuing to function exactly as designed. The second battle ended on a Tuesday. Not that the day of the week meant anything on Geonosis. The hive ran on shift cycles, not calendar designations. And the Republic Standard Calendar had always been a core world concern that the Outer Rim observed when convenient and ignored when not. But the reports that came through the Separatist communication network used Republic Standard timestamps, and the timestamp on the final engagement summary read Tuesday, and Poggle noticed this, the way he noticed everything without assigning it, meaning simply filing it accurately. The battle was over. Geonosis was, for the second time, a Republic-controlled system. Poggle was not on Geonosis when this became final. He had evacuated 3 days before the Republic fleet completed its encirclement, not because he had received advance warning, but because he had read the pattern of incoming vessel movements against the Separatist defense deployment and understood, with the same structural intuition he applied to load calculations, that the tolerances were not going to hold. He left when the numbers told him to leave. He took the foundry production records, the technical documentation, and the design files that could not be replaced. He left the rest. The first decision came 17 days after the evacuation. He was at a Separatist command facility on Mustafar, a temporary posting, one of several locations the Confederacy's leadership had dispersed to following the loss of Geonosis as a primary base of operations. The facility was functional, but not comfortable, designed for operational necessity rather than extended habitation. The corridors smelled of coolant and recycled air, a combination that had no relationship to iron or stone or any of the sensory textures Poggle associated with places where real work happened. The Separatist military command had convened a strategic review. The question on the table was resource allocation, specifically whether the remaining Geonosian production capacity, now operating from secondary facilities in systems adjacent to the Arcanus sector, should be maintained at current output levels or scaled back to conserve resources for a war that was beginning to show patterns that required honest acknowledgement. The Separatist general presenting the review was careful with his language. He did not say the war was going badly. He said the strategic landscape had become more complex than initial projections had anticipated. He said that resource conservation at this stage might enable a more sustainable long-term posture. He was saying, consider stopping. The room waited to hear what Poggle would say. Poggle looked at the production figures. He looked at the resource consumption rates. He looked at the strategic map that the general had displayed, with its color-coded indication of systems under Republic control, Separatist control, and contested status. The Republic color spreading across the display in a pattern that a structural engineer would have recognized immediately as the behavior of weight finding its natural distribution. He said, current output levels will be maintained. He said it the way he announced a material specification in a project review. No discussion invited, no alternative framing offered. A decision delivered as if the deliberation had already occurred somewhere else, and this was simply the communication of its outcome. The general waited a moment, as if expecting elaboration. No elaboration came. The meeting moved on. What was gone from that decision was not visible to anyone in the room. The Poggle of 15 years earlier, the one who had mapped the architecture of the hive's power structure with the methodical attention of someone building a comprehensive case, would not have made that call the way it was made. He would have made it, perhaps. The outcome might have been identical, but the process would have been different. There would have been calculation behind it, a reading of the room, an assessment of which relationships the decision would strengthen and which it would strain, and whether the strains were manageable, and what the secondary effects would be across the network of dependencies he had spent decades constructing. The decision made in that Mustafar facility had none of that behind it. It had momentum. The foundries had been running at full production since the beginning of the war. They had been running when Geonosis was attacked the first time, and they had been rebuilt and run again, and they had been running when Geonosis was attacked the second time, and now they were running from secondary facilities in adjacent systems. And the possibility of them not running of the thing he had spent his entire life building, simply stopping, had not been processed as an actual option. It was not a strategic choice. It was the behavior of a machine that does not have a mechanism for recognizing when it should stop. Poggle had become, in some essential way, the foundry. And the foundry did not deliberate. It ran. The second decision happened 6 weeks later in a technical review session at one of the secondary production facilities. The session was routine progress assessment on a new droid chassis assembly modification that the Separatist military had requested. Poggle had developed the initial design framework for the modification himself, working from the military's specifications. The framework was sound. It solved the stated problem within the stated constraints. A junior architect on the technical team, a young Geonosian named Tessic, recently assigned to the secondary facility from the fragment of the Stalgasin Guild that had survived the second battle, had submitted a supplementary analysis. He had found a way to reduce the assembly time for the new chassis by approximately 12% without any reduction in structural integrity. The approach used a sequencing method that Poggle's framework had not considered. It was genuinely better. Poggle reviewed it during the session. He understood immediately that it was better. The 12% improvement was real. The methodology was sound. And the sequencing approach could be extended to other elements of the production line beyond the immediate modification. A broader application that Tessic had noted in his analysis but not fully developed. Poggle set the supplementary analysis aside. He presented his original framework to the session with a single adjustment, a minor refinement to the component alignment specification that absorbed one element of Tessic's sequencing approach without acknowledging its origin. The adjustment improved his framework's assembly time by approximately 4%. He filed the session outcome under his own authorship. Tessic's supplementary analysis was catalogued under general technical documentation, unattributed. He knew, while he was doing it, exactly what he was doing. This is the thing that resists easy explanation. He was not unaware. He did not rationalize it in the moment as something other than what it was. He was taking a junior architect's superior solution, absorbing the part of it that could be absorbed without obvious attribution, and filing the contribution in a way that ensured the junior architect would receive no recognition for it. He had been on the receiving end of this exact process for most of his professional life. He knew its shape completely. He knew how it felt from inside it. He had spent decades building a private catalog of precisely this kind of erasure, sustaining himself across years of uncredited work, with the knowledge that what you built was real, regardless of whose name appeared on the documentation. He had believed that. He had genuinely believed it. Something in the weeks since the second battle, or perhaps something that had been shifting for much longer, across years of decisions that each felt small at the time, had moved him to the other side of the transaction without his fully registering the crossing. He was now the one with the name that got filed on documentation. He was now the one who could not afford to let a junior architect's work stand on its own, because the junior architect's work, being seen clearly, might create a comparison that Poggle did not want made. He closed the session file. He returned to his workstation. He did not examine this further. The third decision required the least deliberation of all, which is perhaps the most accurate measure of how far the transformation had progressed. A Separatist intelligence contact provided Poggle with a technical analysis, intercepted Republic communications, indicating that the Republic's military engineering division had identified specific patterns in Geonosian droid production and was developing targeted countermeasures. The countermeasures were not yet deployed. They were at the development stage. But they were specific enough, and the intelligence was credible enough, that any Separatist military commander who received this information would immediately begin adjusting tactical deployment of the affected droid units. Poggle read the analysis. He did not forward it to the Separatist military command. What he did instead was contact 3 members of the Separatist Strategic Procurement Committee, the group that oversaw the allocation of military production contracts across the Confederacy's manufacturing network, and present them with a revised proposal for Geonosian production capacity. The proposal repositioned Geonosian output as the most reliable and technically sophisticated element of the Separatist manufacturing base. It cited performance metrics, delivery consistency, and design capability. It argued, with accurate supporting data, that increasing Geonosian production's share of the overall military supply chain was in the Confederacy's best strategic interest. The Procurement Committee, who had not received the intelligence analysis that would have complicated this picture significantly, found the proposal compelling. The new allocation was approved within 2 weeks. 3 weeks after that, the Republic deployed its countermeasures. The droid units affected were not primarily Geonosian-sourced, because Poggle had used the intelligence gap to shift the production mix before the countermeasures arrived. The Separatist commanders who absorbed the impact were from manufacturing networks that had, until recently, held a larger share of the supply contracts. Poggle's production figures looked, in the aftermath, relatively strong. He had betrayed the coalition that had given him his title back. Not enormously. Not in a way that anyone could trace to a specific decision or a specific piece of withheld information. Separatist intelligence was fragmented and inconsistently shared across the network. There were a dozen plausible explanations for why a given analysis had not reached a given commander in time. The gap was real but invisible. The advantage Poggle had extracted was real but deniable. He had done it without anger, without ideology, without any of the emotional texture that typically surrounds betrayal. He had done it the way he made material specifications, because the numbers supported it, because it served the position he was trying to maintain, because the opportunity was there, and the cost of not using it was higher than the cost of using it. He filed the procurement approval in the production records. He moved on to the next item on the work surface. The holographic map of the Geonosian foundry network was displayed on the projection surface in his temporary office at the secondary facility. It was updated daily with operational status reports from each active production site, a real-time picture of what was running, what was damaged, what had been lost. Most of it was red. The color coding was simple: green for fully operational, yellow for partial capacity, red for offline or destroyed. At the beginning of the war, the map had been almost entirely green. During the reconstruction between the 2 battles, it had recovered to a majority green state. Now, in the aftermath of the second Geonosian engagement and the ongoing Republic pressure across Separatist-held systems, the red dominated. Poggle stood in front of the map at the end of a long working day and looked at it. He was not looking at the colors. He was looking at the spatial relationships between the remaining operational sites, the green and yellow indicators that represented what was still functioning. He was reading the map the way he read structural surveys. tracking the load distribution across the surviving network, identifying where the stress was concentrating. His eye moved to a cluster of yellow indicators in the northern sector of the secondary facility network. He knew, without running the formal analysis, that 2 of those sites would be red within 60 days. The production demands placed on them since the loss of the primary Geonosis facilities had exceeded their design tolerances. The output numbers looked acceptable in the current reporting period. The underlying structural condition of the facilities did not match the output numbers. He had seen this pattern before. In the northern shaft collapse, in the pre-battle maintenance backlog, in every situation where a system was asked to perform beyond its actual capacity and the performance numbers lagged behind the reality by just enough time to make the problem invisible until it was not. He could identify it anywhere. He was still, without question, the most capable architectural mind in any room he entered. He looked at the 2 yellow indicators that were going to go red. He thought about filing a maintenance priority report. He thought about what the maintenance priority report would reveal about the current production commitments he had just successfully argued for with the procurement committee. He did not file the report. He turned off the projection. He went to his quarters. The room had no windows. Secondary facility design prioritized function over anything else, and windows in a pressurized installation at this depth into a non-hospitable planetary system were an unnecessary structural complication. He had been in rooms without windows before. He had spent years in the lower hive tunnels where the concept of a window was irrelevant, where the amber light of Geonosis's surface was something you experienced by going up, not by looking sideways. But the tunnels had never felt like this. The tunnels had always felt like somewhere he was building toward something. This room felt like the thing he had been building toward. He sat on the edge of the bunk. He did not perform the first scratch. For the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he simply sat in a room with no surface worth beginning on, and did not reach for one. The most complete version of Poggle the Lesser and the most powerful version were, at this stage of his life, indistinguishable from the outside. He held his title. He controlled production. He had just successfully repositioned Geonosian manufacturing within the Separatist hierarchy at the expense of his allies and to the direct benefit of his own standing. Every external measure of his situation indicated someone operating at the height of their capability. What the external measures could not capture, what had no instrument and no documentation and no formal record anywhere, was the specific quality of the room he was sitting in. What it felt like to have arrived, completely and without possibility of revision, at the destination that every prior decision had been pointed toward, and to find that the destination was exactly this: a room, a bunk, work waiting in the morning, the map with its spreading red, and the absence, for the first time, of the gesture that had marked every beginning of his professional life, the reach toward a surface, the line drawn through dust or stone or air, the signal to himself and to no one else that something was about to be made. He did not reach for a surface that night. He simply sat, and the sitting had a weight that the tunnels had never had, because the tunnels had always been a means. And this, finally, was the end. He knew the catacombs better than anyone alive. Every junction, every branch, every chamber carved by workers whose names the hive had absorbed without recording. He had walked these passages more times than he could count to meet Dooku, to inspect the lower infrastructure, to stand at the threshold of the deep chamber and listen to the stone settle. He knew where the ceiling dropped without warning. He knew which corridors appeared to dead end but didn't. He knew the specific acoustic quality of each section where sound carried and where it was swallowed, where a voice raised to normal volume would travel 20 meters and where it would disappear after 5. He knew all of it, and he was still running. The sounds of the second battle had been present for hours before Poggle moved into the catacombs. He had stayed at the command position longer than was advisable, reviewing the defense disposition reports as the Republic assault progressed, making adjustments that the situation made increasingly irrelevant. At some point, not a dramatic point, not a moment of obvious decision, he had looked at the incoming data and understood that the command position was no longer a place where decisions could affect outcomes. He gathered the essential documentation. He moved to the lower levels. The catacombs were below the worst of the surface bombardment, deep enough that the vibration from above arrived as a distant pressure rather than immediate violence. The air was the same as it had always been, cool, still. That specific mineral quality that belonged to enclosed rock and nothing else. In a different circumstance, the familiarity of it might have been steadying. In this circumstance, it was something else. He moved through the passages at a pace that was controlled, but not slow. He had a route. He had always had a route. The evacuation pathway from the lower levels had been part of his operational planning since the reconstruction period after the first battle. A specific sequence of junctions that led to an exterior exit point on the southern face of the hive complex, where a transport had been positioned for exactly this contingency. He had designed the contingency himself. He had not designed for the possibility that someone would already be in the catacombs. He heard them before he saw them. Not their voices, the passages absorbed voice too efficiently for that. What he heard was the specific sound of movement in the deep corridors, footsteps with a rhythm that was not Geonosian. The weight distribution was wrong, the pace too even, the stride length inconsistent with any species that had grown up navigating hive architecture. Off-worlders, moving with purpose, moving in his direction. He changed his route. The alternative path was longer. It added approximately 8 minutes to the extraction timeline, which was 8 minutes he had not built into the contingency plan because the contingency plan had not accounted for pursuit. He moved through a junction he had not used in years, a section of the catacomb network that predated his time in the guild, older than the foundry network, carved by workers from a period when the passages had served a different purpose that the hive's current records did not clearly document. The stone here was a different color, darker. The amber was gone, replaced by something deeper, a reddish-brown, that the older rock produced, a geological stratum that the later construction had built above and around without disturbing. He moved through it quickly. The sounds behind him continued. What Poggle felt in those passages was not fear in any form he would have recognized by that name. It was something more specific and in some ways more difficult. It was the sensation of a structure he had built being used against him. Every turn he took, every junction he navigated, every section he moved through, he had designed the principles that governed this space. The drainage, the ventilation, the load-bearing relationships between the carved passages and the natural rock above them. He knew why every corridor ran in the direction it ran, because the direction had been chosen according to engineering logic he had either applied himself or inherited and understood completely. And now that knowledge was not helping him. The people following him were navigating the same space without his knowledge of it, and were not falling behind. This told him something about them that the intelligence reports had not fully conveyed. He reached a junction where his planned route and his alternative route converged. He stopped for a moment. He listened. The sounds of pursuit were coming from the left branch, his original path, which meant they had anticipated the route or had divided and covered both options simultaneously. He took the right branch. The right branch was not in any evacuation plan. It was simply a passage he remembered from an inspection walk 12 years earlier, one that he had filed in his private catalogue without any particular intention. The way he filed everything, because you never knew which piece of information would become the piece you needed. It led, eventually, to a natural chamber in the deepest section of the catacomb network, a space where the carved passages gave way to unmodified geology, where the hive's construction had reached its limit and stopped, and the rock continued in its own unplanned configurations. He reached the chamber. He turned. Master Luminara, Unduli, was already there. He did not know, in that moment, how she had reached the chamber before him. The Force offered explanations that his understanding of the world did not have architecture for. She was simply there, standing in the unmodified rock of the deepest catacomb space, her lightsaber not yet drawn, her expression carrying the specific quality of someone who has been waiting a reasonable amount of time and is not particularly surprised that the waiting is over. Her Padawan appeared at the passage entrance behind him. Poggle stood between them. He performed a rapid assessment of the situation. This took approximately 2 seconds. The assessment produced a single, clear output. There was no exit. He had built no contingency for this specific configuration, because the specific configuration had seemed, when he was building contingencies, like one that his knowledge of the catacombs would prevent. His knowledge of the catacombs had been insufficient. The Force had a different relationship with space than engineering did. He set down the documentation he was carrying. He did not resist. The transport to Coruscant took 4 days. Poggle spent most of those 4 days in a secure holding compartment that was, by any functional measure, adequate. The temperature was regulated. The lighting was consistent. Food was provided at regular intervals, in a form that his biology could process without difficulty. He was not mistreated. He was not spoken to beyond what procedure required. He was also, for the first time in his life, on a vessel traveling toward Coruscant. He had dealt with core world representatives his entire career. He had negotiated with them, consulted for them, supplied them with technical solutions they could not produce themselves. They had always come to him, to Geonosis, to trade stations, to the neutral locations that off-world business used when it needed to move through the outer rim without formal documentation. He had never gone to them. Coruscant had been, for the full span of his professional life, the place where the people who ran the systems that excluded him lived, the Senate that wrote trade regulations favoring core world interests, the financial institutions that set the credit terms that kept outer rim economies in permanent dependency, the republic that had, for the length of the war, been trying to destroy everything he had built. He arrived at it as a prisoner. The holding facility where he was placed was not located in any of the districts he had imagined when he thought about the planet, which he had done, occasionally, across the decades. In the abstract way, you think about places that exist as concepts before they exist as locations. It was in a mid-level administrative sector, in a building that from the exterior was indistinguishable from several thousand others in its district, functional, unremarkable, designed to process a particular category of occupant efficiently and without incident. His cell was on an interior level. No exterior exposure, no view of the city planet that spread in every direction for as far as any measurement could reach. No windows. The days in the cell had a texture that Poggle had not anticipated. He had been in uncomfortable situations before. Exile had been uncomfortable. The secondary facility on Mustafar had been uncomfortable. He had operated under resource constraints and time pressure, and the ongoing presence of a war that was not going the way anyone had planned, and none of it had produced in him anything that functioned like helplessness. The cell produced something close to it, not because of the cell itself. The cell was adequate. The problem was not the cell. The problem was the silence. Not the silence of the deep catacombs. That silence had been rich with geological texture, full of the slow settling sounds of ancient rock. Not the silence of the lower foundry tunnels late in the night shift, which had always carried the distant vibration of the machinery as a kind of underpresence. The silence of the cell was institutional, processed. The silence of a space designed to contain rather than to exist. It had no mineral quality, no geological depth, no relationship to any natural process. It was the silence of recycled air and temperature regulation, and the complete absence of anything that had not been deliberately placed there by people who had thought about it in terms of security requirements. He could feel, in that silence, the absolute distance between this place and the amber-lit tunnels where he had spent his life. The hive was not present here, not as a feeling, not as a texture, not even as the ghost of itself that Exile had produced. The hive was simply not reachable from this location, too far, too thoroughly insulated by the layers of core world infrastructure between this cell and any Geonosian soil. He was more alone here than he had been in Exile. In Exile, at least, the planet had been in the same sky. Anakin Skywalker came on the 12th day. Master Luminara Unduli had visited twice before that, formal interviews, conducted through proper channels, requesting information about Separatist military infrastructure. Poggle had responded to these sessions with the same approach he had used throughout the succession proceedings after Hadis's death. He answered the questions he was asked. He provided nothing beyond what was directly requested. He gave no response that could be built into something useful. Unduli had been precise and professional. She had pushed where the procedure allowed her to push and stopped where it did not. She had, in the end, obtained very little. Skywalker did not use the same procedure. He came alone, which was the first indication that what was about to happen was not a formal interview. He sat across the table in the meeting room, and he looked at Poggle with an attention that was different in quality from anything Poggle had experienced from a Jedi before. Not the measured assessment of Luminara Unduli. Something rawer than that. Something that had decided, before entering the room, that the normal constraints on this interaction did not apply. He asked about the brainworm queen. The Geonosian parasite organism that the Republic had encountered being deployed as a biological weapon. He wanted to know the location of the host queen. He wanted to know the scope of the deployment program. Poggle said nothing. Skywalker asked again. What followed lasted approximately 20 minutes. It was not torture in the way the word typically implies. No physical implements, no injury that could be documented, nothing that would have been visible afterward in any standard medical evaluation. The force, applied by someone who understood how to use it as a tool of compulsion rather than simply as an extension of combat capability, worked on a different level. It found the edges of resistance and applied pressure there, specifically, precisely, in a way that was calibrated to the individual, that read what a particular creature's particular defenses were constructed from, and then went after the foundations. Poggle had faced many things in his life that required him to be still and give nothing away. He had never faced anything that could reach into the stillness and find what was underneath it. He broke at 17 minutes. He gave Skywalker the location. He gave him the relevant information about the Queen's operational status. He gave enough to end the session. Then he went quiet. Not the stillness of composure, a different quality, the quiet of something that has been reached and does not know yet what the reaching has cost it. Skywalker left. The room was empty. Poggle sat in it for a moment, before the security personnel returned to take him back to the cell. He did not perform any visible response to what had just happened. He did not shake. He did not make a sound. He stood when they indicated he should stand. He walked when they indicated he should walk. He was, in every observable way, the same as he had been when he entered the room. The narrator cannot say what was true beneath the surface of that composure. The narrator can only report what was visible. Back in the cell, he sat on the bunk. The institutional silence continued. The recycled air continued. The temperature regulation continued. Everything designed to process and contain continued performing its function with complete indifference to what had just occurred in the room down the corridor. He sat for a long time. At some point, he did not track when exactly he raised one finger and placed it against the wall beside the bunk. The surface was smooth, a composite material, uniform in texture, with no variation in density or composition, nothing like rock, nothing like the surfaces he had spent his life working with. No iron smell, no geological history, no connection to any natural process that had taken millions of years to produce the material. He pressed his fingertip against it. He drew it slowly across the wall. A long line, deliberate. The full extension of his arm from one side to the other. The first scratch on a surface that would never become anything, in a room that had no project inside it. A gesture performed not to begin construction, but because it was the only thing left that was entirely his, that no succession proceeding, no exile order, no force-wielding Jedi in a basement room could reach into and take. He looked at the line on the wall. It was very faint. The composite material did not mark easily. In the institutional lighting of the cell, the line was barely visible, a slight disruption in the surface texture, present if you knew to look for it, invisible otherwise. He looked at it anyway. Outside the cell, Coruscant continued in every direction without pause. The largest city ever built by any civilization in the history of the Republic, a planet covered entirely in the work of other hands. Structures reaching into the atmosphere, foundations cut into the planetary crust, infrastructure of a scale that made the Stalgasan hive's entire history look like a preliminary sketch. All of it built by people whose names were not on it. He looked at the faint line on the wall. The question the wall asked him, in its silence, was not one he had a prepared answer for. He had been asked many things across a very long life. He had answered most of them with precision and patience, and the complete, methodical attention of someone who had always known exactly what they were doing and why. The wall asked, "What did you build all of this for?" He did not answer it that night. He lay back on the bunk. The silence continued. The line on the wall remained, faint and almost invisible, exactly where he had drawn it. He was still alive. This was not nothing he had survived, things that a more fragile creature would not have survived, and the fact of continued existence retained its own logic, independent of what that existence currently contained. He had outlasted Hades. He had outlasted Exile. He had outlasted 2 Republic assaults on his world, and the slow erosion of a war that was not going the way anyone had planned. He had even, in some technical sense, outlasted a Jedi's attempt to reach into him and find what he was made of, because he was still here, still breathing the recycled institutional air, still capable of the gesture that had marked every beginning of his working life. What he had not yet found a way to outlast was the question, the one the wall kept asking in its silence, night after night, in the language of an empty surface, with a barely visible line drawn across it by a creature who had spent an entire life building things that other names owned, and had finally built his way to a room with no windows and a wall with no purpose, and a gesture that had always meant the beginning of something now performed with nothing to begin. This chapter does not belong to Poggle. He is still alive during the events described here, held somewhere in the Republic's detention network, in a cell with recycled air and no windows and a barely visible line drawn on the wall beside the bunk. He is present in the galaxy. He is breathing. He is, by any formal measure, still the Archduke of the Geonosian hive, still holding a title that the hive's surviving administration has not officially revoked, because the procedures for revoking it require a quorum of hive lords that the second battle made impossible to assemble. But this chapter belongs to the people he left behind, not because their perspective is more important than his, because it is the only one that can see him clearly. The engineer. His name was Burak, and he had worked the Geonosian foundry network for 41 years before the second battle ended his career by ending the foundry. He was not an exceptional engineer. He understood this about himself without distress. He had the specific self-knowledge of someone who has spent decades working alongside exceptional people and developed, through that proximity, an accurate sense of the distance between his own abilities and theirs. He was reliable. He was precise within his range. He showed up and did the work correctly and did not cause problems. What he had, that many of the more gifted engineers around him lacked, was attention. He noticed things. He had noticed Poggle from the first year the younger drone appeared in the construction guild. Noticed him not as a political figure or an administrative presence, but as a specific kind of mind, operating in a specific kind of way. The stillness of him in the construction bays. The way he listened to the resonance drills entering fresh rock, with an expression that Burak had spent years trying to find a word for and never quite managed. Not longing, not satisfaction, something between the two that had no single name. He had watched Poggle's designs get filed under other names for years before he understood what he was watching. When he understood it, he said nothing, because saying something would have required him to explain how he knew, and explaining how he knew would have required him to account for the quality of attention he had been paying, and he was not sure the hive's attribution system had a category for that kind of witness. He had been in the lower foundry, Kree's old foundry, the rebuilt one with the columns spaced in the pattern that did not match the engineering requirements when the second battle's bombardment reached the deep levels. The ceiling of the access corridor had come down in sections. He had been fortunate, in the specific geometry of his location, a junction point where the load distributed across 3 separate structural elements rather than concentrating in one. The sections fell around him rather than on him. He crawled out through a gap in the debris and emerged onto the surface of a Geonosis he did not recognize. In the years after, he did not rebuild. There was nothing left in his sector of the network that rebuilding could address within any realistic resource constraint. He survived on the margins of the Republic's occupation infrastructure, performing small maintenance tasks on equipment the occupation forces needed functioning and did not have the technical knowledge to service themselves. He thought about Poggle occasionally. not with loyalty or grief, or any of the emotions that a simpler version of this story might assign to a long-serving worker thinking about the leader who had run the operation they devoted their life to. What he felt was more like the specific discomfort of an incomplete calculation, a problem he had all the data for, but could not resolve because one variable remained unknown. He had watched Poggle build everything the hive had become during those decades. He had watched him do it with a precision and a patience that Burek had never seen matched by anyone else in the guild. He had watched the name that meant not enough become, across those years, the name that everything in the hive's production capacity ultimately depended on. And then he had watched the hive become rubble. The calculation he could not complete was this: at what point, if any, had Poggle looked at what he was building toward and understood that the destination included this, not as a political outcome, as a physical reality? The specific broken geography of the world he had spent his life constructing things inside. Burek did not have an answer. He was not sure Poggle had had one either. That uncertainty was the thing he carried with him out of the debris and into the long, quiet years of occupation. The logistics officer, Lok Dara, had been in the Trade Federation's Outer Operations Division for 23 years when the Clone Wars began, and he had developed across those years the particular professional skill of reading people accurately within the first few minutes of contact. He had been wrong about Poggle from the beginning, not in his assessment of the capability that had been immediately and obviously correct, the thinking behind the droid manufacturing framework visible to anyone who read carefully enough. What he had misread was the texture beneath the capability. He had assumed, in those early private consultations, that what he was dealing with was a creature who had been held back and wanted recognition. Someone whose ambitions were frustrated, and who was therefore available for the kind of arrangement that the Federation's Outer Operations Division regularly made with talented people in difficult positions. He had offered recognition in his oblique professional way, the implication that the Federation could provide a context in which Poggle's contributions would be properly attributed, properly compensated, properly valued. Poggle had accepted the payment and shown absolutely no interest in the recognition. It had taken Dara several more meetings to understand why. The recognition was not what Poggle was after. He was after something that the Trade Federation, with all its resources and all its reach, was not structured to provide, not because it lacked the capability, but because the thing Poggle wanted did not exist in a form that any external entity could hand to someone. He wanted to be the one who owned what he built, not acknowledged as the one who built it, not credited in the documentation. The actual owner, the title, the authority, the position from which no attribution system could exclude him because he was the attribution system. Dara had understood this eventually. He had respected it. In the detached professional way he respected any clearly defined objective pursued with consistent methodology. There was nothing ambiguous about what Poggle was doing, once you understood what he was actually trying to do. Every decision made sense when read against that goal. Every alliance, every consultation, every carefully maintained relationship, all of it oriented toward the single outcome of returning to Geonosis with the title that had been assessed out of reach before he emerged from the pupa chamber. What Dara had not factored into his assessment, what he only came to understand much later, in the years after the Clone Wars ended and the Federation's own complicated relationship with the Empire began, was what that specific goal cost the person pursuing it. Not in the political sense, not in the tactical sense, in the interior sense. He had sat across from Poggle in enough meetings to have accumulated a detailed impression of what the creature looked like when he was fully present in a conversation versus when he was present in body while the actual thinking was happening somewhere that the conversation could not reach. In the early years, Poggle had been fully present, almost always attentive, responsive, processing what was in front of him, with the complete engagement of someone who finds most problems genuinely interesting. By the later years, before the capture, the ratio had shifted. Something had relocated to a distance that the meetings could not reach. The precision remained. The capability remained. But the thing underneath the precision, whatever it was, that had made those early consultations feel like genuine exchange rather than simple transaction, had moved somewhere that Lokdara's professional skill for reading people could not find. He had noted this in his private records. He had not known at the time what it meant. He thought he knew now. The drone. She did not have a name that translated meaningfully into basic. The hive designation she carried was functional, a classification of role and origin sector, the kind of identifier that the Guild's record system used for operational tracking. It appears in the post-war documentation as a reference number. She appears twice in the surviving records, once in a Republic occupation census of surviving Geonosian workers, once in a maintenance log for a reconstruction project in the outer sectors of the former Stalgassan territory. She had been a mid-level assembly worker in the foundry network's second phase, one of the thousands of drones whose specific function was the physical construction of components that the architects designed and the senior engineers specified and the foreman scheduled. She had not known Poggle directly. She had worked in facilities where his designs were being built, under supervisors who were implementing specifications that had originated somewhere above her operational level. She had survived the second battle in the way that many survivors survive catastrophic events through a combination of circumstance and the specific geometry of where she happened to be standing when the worst of it occurred. In the years following, she worked in the reconstruction efforts that the surviving population attempted in the outer sectors, the areas far enough from the Republic's primary occupation zones that there was physical space to rebuild, if not quite the resources to do it adequately. She began performing the gesture without knowing where it came from. This is the part that has no clean explanation. At some point in the early reconstruction period, she could not have identified the specific occasion if asked. She started drawing a line across whatever surface she was about to work on before beginning the work. A single deliberate mark, the full reach of her arm from one side to the other. Then the work would begin. She did not know she had acquired this habit from an observed behavior. She did not remember seeing it performed. She had been in too many workspaces, with too many workers across too many shifts to trace where any specific gesture had entered her practice. But it was there. The workers around her noticed it without commenting on it. Over several months, two of them began doing something similar, not identical. Not a conscious adoption, but a related gesture. A mark before beginning, an acknowledgement that the surface was about to be changed by the work that followed. The habit spread the way habits spread through collective organisms. Slowly, without announcement, without anyone deciding to propagate it. By the time the Republic's Occupation Administration conducted its reconstruction assessment in the outer sectors, the gesture was present in enough work crews that the assessment officer noted it in his report as a Geonosian cultural practice he could not find documentation for in any pre-war record. He was not wrong that there was no pre-war documentation. He was wrong that it was a cultural practice in any traditional sense. It was a single creature's private ritual, carried in the bodies of people who had worked in his spaces without ever knowing whose gesture they had absorbed. The world, Geonosis, in the final years of the Clone Wars, was not the world Poggle had built his life around. It occupied the same coordinates. It had the same ring system, the same amber-filtered light, the same geological formations rising from the surface in their irregular columns. The rock was the same rock. The iron smell of the deep tunnels in the sections where tunnels still existed intact enough to enter was the same smell. Everything else had changed. The population numbers, which the hive had never formally tracked in the way the Republic tracked census data, could be estimated from production records and occupation surveys. The estimates produced a range that the Republic analysts who compiled them described, in their official language, as significant demographic reduction. What that phrase meant, translated into the texture of lived experience, was this. The hive mind was thin, not the way it had been thin in the aftermath of the first battle, depleted but recovering, the fabric strained but recognizably the same fabric. What remained in the years after the second battle was something that had passed through a threshold. The collective awareness that connected every Geonosian in the Stalgassen network, that had functioned as a kind of shared sensory field. A low, persistent warmth of mutual presence was so reduced that the surviving members of the hive reported experiencing something that no Geonosian had ever had language for before. Aloneness. The individual experience of existing without the collective register that had always been present underneath individual awareness. The way the sound of the foundry had always been present in the rock beneath the tunnels. The foundries were not running. Most of them were not standing. The ones that were still structurally intact were under Republic administration, their production redirected to Republic supply chains under occupation protocols that would remain in place for years. Geonosian workers operated within these facilities under supervision, producing components for an entity that had spent the last several years trying to destroy the civilization that had built the production network in the first place. The amber light came through the ring system the same way it always had, every morning making the sky look like late afternoon, making the day look, from the beginning, like the end of something. The last Geonosian foundry, operating under independent Stalgassen authority, went offline in the 19th month of Poggle's imprisonment on Coruscant. It was not destroyed. It simply ran out of the materials and the personnel and the supply chain infrastructure required to keep operating. And the combination of those three deficits reached a point where continuation was no longer possible, and the machinery stopped. The silence that followed was not only physical. Through whatever mechanism the hive mind uses to transmit collective experience across distances that no instrument has ever successfully measured, through the specific channel of shared Geonosian consciousness that Poggle had felt. As warmth, when he returned from exile, and as progressive thinning throughout the war, and as absolute distance from the prison cell on Coruscant, the stopping of the last foundry traveled. Whether it reached him, whether he felt it, whether the register that had always carried the hive's collective texture was still functional enough in his specific isolation to receive what the collective sent. This is the one thing in this entire account that cannot be recovered. The records do not contain it. The surviving witnesses were not present. The narrator does not know. What can be said is this. On the 19th month of his imprisonment, Poggle's behavior was logged by the facility's routine monitoring as unchanged from prior periods. He ate, he slept. He was present and compliant during the procedural checks. He did not cause incidents. He traced the line on the wall, as he had done every night since the first night. Whether the gesture meant the same thing it had always meant, or something different, or nothing at all by that point, this also cannot be recovered. The wall does not report what it received. The stone keeps everything it is given. The last foundry went quiet 6 months before Poggle himself did. The silence moved through channels that have no name in any language the Republic used to document the war and its aftermath. It arrived wherever it arrived, and was felt by whoever felt it, and left no trace that any record system could capture. What Poggle experienced in the 19th month of his imprisonment in a cell on Coruscant, while the last machinery of his life's work stopped running on a world he could not reach. This is the permanent gap in this account. Not because the answer is unknowable in principle, because the only person who could have answered it is the one person this story was never able to reach inside. Everything else in this account, the designs, the decisions, the catacomb meeting, the line on the wall, all of it is visible from the outside if you look with sufficient attention. This one thing was only ever interior, and the interior, in the end, kept its own record. Mustafar is not a world that welcomes construction. The surface moves, not in the way that all planetary surfaces move, the slow geological drift of tectonic systems operating across timescales longer than civilization. Mustafar moves on a human timescale, on a Geonosian timescale. The lava flows shift course between morning and evening. Ground that is solid at 1 hour is compromised at the next. The thermal variation across the surface is so extreme and so unpredictable that any structure built on it requires constant monitoring, constant adjustment, constant renegotiation with a geology that has no interest in remaining stable long enough to be built upon. Poggle would have understood this immediately upon arrival. He would have assessed the facility the way he assessed every structure he encountered, reading the load relationships, the foundation choices, the design decisions that the builders had made in response to the specific challenges of this ground. He would have identified, within the first hour, which elements of the facility were well conceived and which were not. He would have noted the single access corridor, the limited exit options, the way the surrounding lava fields created a perimeter that no engineering could have made more effective as a containment boundary. He would have known what this place was. Not a refuge, not a command post in any meaningful operational sense. A room with one door. He had spent his life understanding the difference between a space designed for work and a space designed for something else. Mustafar's facility was designed, whether its current occupants understood this or not, for an ending. How Poggle came to be here is a gap in the record. The last confirmed documentation of his location places him in Republic custody on Coruscant. What happened between that documentation and his presence in the Mustafar facility, whether he was transferred, released as part of a negotiation, extracted by Separatist operatives in the final chaotic months of the war, none of this survived in any archive that has been recovered. He is simply here. The narrator acknowledges this gap without attempting to fill it with invention. Some things are absent from the record because they were never recorded. Some things are absent because the records were deliberately removed. Some things are absent because every person who knew them died in circumstances that did not permit documentation. Poggle is in the facility on Mustafar. He is sitting with the others. This is what is known. The Separatist Council in those final hours was a diminished assembly. The figures gathered in the facility represented what remained of an organization that had, at its peak, coordinated the military and economic resources of thousands of systems in opposition to the Republic. Newt Gunray, Viceroy of the Trade Federation, who had spent the entire war in a state of increasing anxiety that he had managed, with variable success, to conceal beneath layers of formal manner. Wat Tambor of the Techno-Union, whose augmented physiology gave him the appearance of composure that his actual internal state did not match. Rune Hako, whose long association with Gunray had produced in him the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent decades being the cautious voice in conversations where caution was consistently overruled. And others, and Poggle. And the conversation in the facility, in those hours of waiting, is not preserved in any record. What was said, what assessments were shared or withheld, what each of them understood about their situation, and what they chose to perform, not understanding, none of it survived. What can be observed from the outside is the room itself. A facility built on unstable ground, on a world that does not permit stillness, occupied by the remnant leadership of a failing cause, waiting for a communication that had been described to them as a resolution, and that Poggle, at minimum, understood was not going to be the kind of resolution any of them would have chosen. Whether he communicated this understanding to the others is unknown. Whether he looked for an exit and found none, or looked for an exit and did not look, or had already moved past the category of exits into something quieter, this also is not in the record. He was there. He waited with the others. Outside the facility, Mustafar's surface continued its constant renegotiation with itself. The lava moved. The ground shifted by fractions. The thermal columns rose from the flows and distorted the air above them in patterns that had no relationship to any engineering logic. A world that could not hold a line drawn across it for more than minutes before the heat erased it. The first scratch on Mustafar would disappear before the hand that made it could lift away. Vader arrived without announcement. This is consistent with every account of how Darth Vader moved through the world in those early years of his existence, not as a figure who announced himself, but as a presence that arrived and then was simply there, in the room, with the full weight of what he had become preceding him by a fraction of a second, in a way that every living creature in proximity registered before any conscious processing had occurred. He was very tall. He was dressed entirely in black, in the armor that the Emperor's medical infrastructure had built around what remained of Anakin Skywalker after Mustafar's other cruelties had finished with him. The breathing apparatus made a sound that was entirely regular and entirely wrong, the rhythm of a living system managed by a mechanical one, the specific sound of something that should be organic being sustained by something that was not. The council members responded to his arrival in ways consistent with their individual characters. Gunray's anxiety, so long managed beneath formal surfaces, broke through immediately. Tambor's augmented composure held a moment longer before it also failed. Hako went very still in a way that was not composure, but its opposite, the stillness of a creature that has understood something and has no response available that would change it. What Poggle did in that moment where he looked, what his expression held, whether the stillness he had cultivated across an entire professional lifetime was present or finally absent, is not recorded. The narrator will not invent it. The chapter will not describe what followed in the terms of action. This is a deliberate choice, and the reasons for it are the same reasons that have governed every chapter of this account. The events themselves are documented elsewhere, in the clinical language of historical record and the dramatic language of retrospective account. What happened in the Mustafar facility when Vader moved through it is not a mystery requiring illumination. What this account is interested in is the room. the way a space changes when someone is removed from it. Each absence created a different quality of silence. Not because the silences were different in any acoustically measurable way, the facility's atmosphere did not change. The sounds of Mustafar's geological activity outside the walls continued without regard for what was occurring inside. The silences were different because each person who had occupied a portion of the room's collective awareness left a specific shape of vacancy when they were gone. The room did not become emptier in a uniform way. It became emptier in the particular shape of each individual absence. Gunray's absence was loud, somehow, in a way that his presence had also been loud, an anxious energy that had filled more of the room than his physical form accounted for. Tambor's absence was more mechanical. The augmented systems had contributed their own kind of presence. Without them, something technical went out of the room. Harko's absence was the quietest. He had been going quiet for years. Poggle was among the last. What his absence left in the room, what specific shape of vacancy his removal created in the remaining space, is the question this account cannot answer with the precision it would require to be accurate. He had always been difficult to read. He was difficult to read in his absence as well. The facility on Mustafar went quiet. Outside, the lava continued moving. The thermal columns continued rising. The ground continued its perpetual renegotiation with the forces acting upon it. Mustafar did not mark the occasion. It had no mechanism for marking occasions. It simply continued being what it was, a world in constant geological process, indifferent to the events occurring on its surface, focused entirely on the ancient and enormous work of its own ongoing formation. The dark side of the Force, which had been building toward this moment across decades of careful preparation, registered something that those sensitive to it would later describe as a kind of settling. A vast weight finding its final distribution. The war ending not in any military sense, the fighting would continue for some time, but in the deeper sense of a structure completing its load transfer. The Republic becoming the Empire, the Jedi becoming fugitives, the Sith becoming, for the first time in 1,000 years, the acknowledged power rather than the hidden one. In this moment, in a facility on a volcanic world, among the last official acts of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, Poggle the Lesser, Archduke of Geonosis, master of the Stalgassan hive, the creature who had corrected the Death Star's plating calculations in a catacomb chamber and handed the plans to a man in a dark robe and walked back up to the foundries, ceased to exist as a living presence in the galaxy. He had been, to the end, the best structural mind in any room he occupied. The room was empty now. The Death Star continued. This is the fact that Poggle's death did not change. The design he had reviewed in the catacombs, the correction he had made to the plating specification, the plans he had transferred to Dooku, all of it had long since moved beyond any point where his continued existence or absence affected its trajectory. The weapon was under construction in a classified location that the new empire was funding and staffing and protecting with the full resources of a galactic government that no longer had to maintain the pretense of being anything other than what it was. The empire did not need Poggle anymore. It had what it had needed from him. Geonosis, in the years following the end of the Clone Wars, became something that the historical record handles with unusual brevity. The Empire, consolidating its control over the galaxy's manufacturing infrastructure, identified Geonosis as a security concern. The Geonosian species had been directly involved in the Death Star's design and early construction. They had knowledge distributed across the hive mind, embedded in the collective awareness of a species that the Empire's security apparatus determined could not be permitted to remain in circulation. The solution the Empire implemented was not subtle. It was, by the measures available to assess such things, almost complete. The sterilization of Geonosis, the orbital bombardment and atmospheric processing that the Empire deployed across the planet's surface, was not a military operation in any conventional sense. There was no opposing force. There was no tactical objective beyond the one that was achieved. The Geonosian population, already severely reduced by the 2 battles of the Clone Wars, was reduced further, to a remnant so small that the species' long-term survival became a question that subsequent decades did not definitively answer. The hive mind, which had been thinning since the first battle, went through a threshold from which no recovery was possible. What remained was fragments. Individual survivors, scattered across whatever locations the bombardment had not reached, without the collective fabric that had always been the substrate of Geonosian existence. Not a damaged version of what the hive had been. Something fundamentally different. Something that had no name in Geonosian tradition, because Geonosian tradition had never needed a name for it. The weapon that Poggle had reviewed in the catacombs, whose plating he had corrected, whose viability he had improved with 4 lines of calculation, that weapon was used to destroy Alderaan, a planet. Its people. Everything on it, and above it, and connected to it. He had made it more durable. He had made it last longer. He had handed it to the organization that used it to end his own world. The irony is not dramatic. It does not arrive with the texture of a story's revelation. It simply sits in the factual record, available to anyone who looks at the sequence of events with the full picture visible. A name that meant not enough given to a creature who spent his entire existence proving it wrong. A weapon designed to be sufficient for any target. A people erased by the thing their most gifted member had made more viable. The argument he had spent his life constructing the case against the name. The evidence assembled across decades that what the hive had assessed at his emergence was incorrect, was answered by the galaxy in the most total way available. Not with a counter-argument. With silence. There is a survivor in the records. A single Geonosian drone, documented in a Republic archaeological survey conducted in the decades after the sterilization, living in the ruins of the outer Stalgassan territory. The survey team encountered the drone while cataloging the structural remains of the hive complex, the sections that had survived the bombardment, which were fewer than the sections that had not. The survey report notes, in the dry language of archaeological documentation, that the survivor was observed engaging in what appeared to be a ritualistic behavior before beginning each work session in the ruins. The behavior is described as follows. The drone would locate a relatively flat section of available rock surface, raise one hand or wingtip, and draw a single deliberate line across it. The full reach of the arm from one side to the other. Then the work would begin. The survey team asked, through a translation system, what the gesture meant. The drone's response, as translated, was, "It is how you tell the stone that something is about to be made." The survey team noted this and moved on to the next section of the structural catalog. They had no context for what they had observed. They did not know where the gesture had come from, or how many hands it had passed through before arriving in this survivor's practice, or what it had meant to the creature who first performed it as a private ritual in the lower tunnels of a hive that no longer existed. They documented it as a cultural remnant. They were not wrong. They were also not entirely right. The Force does not forget. This is not a metaphysical claim requiring belief. It is an observable property of the Force, as documented by those sensitive to it across thousands of years of recorded history. Places where significant events occurred retain something not memory, in any conscious sense. Not a recording that can be played back with accuracy. More like resonance. The specific frequency of what happened, continuing to vibrate in the location where it happened, at a level below ordinary perception, available to those who know how to be still enough to receive it. The catacombs beneath what had been the Stalgasson hive complex were, in the years after the sterilization, among the deepest surviving structures on Geonosis. The bombardment had not reached them. They were intact, the carved passages, the chambers, the table in the catacomb room, where a data cylinder had been handed across between two figures whose decisions would shape the galaxy for decades. The table was still there. The stone was still the same stone. The air in the deep passages still had its specific mineral quality that enclosed ancient atmosphere that had nothing to do with any current operation and everything to do with the simple fact of rock that had been sealed from the surface for centuries. And in the specific register of the force that records what has occurred in a location in the resonance of that catacomb chamber, something remained that a sensitive person standing in that space might have received as a kind of pressure. Not sound, not image, pressure. The specific weight of a decision made in this room, in this air, at this table, that had traveled outward from this point and encompassed systems and planets and species in its consequences. The Force recorded it. The Force did not assign it meaning. The Force does not do that. It records, it resonates. It holds what has happened without commentary and without comfort and without the narrative organization that living creatures impose on events to make them bearable. The weight of Poggle, the Lesser's life, the naming ceremony, the tunnels, the designs filed under other names, the Exile, the Alliance, the catacomb meeting, the line drawn on a prison wall, the room on Mustafar that had one door, all of it was present in the Force, the way geological strata are present in rock, compressed, layered, available to those who knew how to read stone, not resolved, not redeemed, not answered, simply present in the record that the Force keeps of everything that has ever been, without exception, without preference, without the mercy of forgetting. The ruins of Geonosis were quiet. The amber light came through what remained of the ring system at its usual angle, that permanent quality of late afternoon, the light that had always made every morning look like the end of something. It fell on broken rock and collapsed tunnel entrances and the remains of structures that had been, at their peak, among the most sophisticated manufacturing facilities the Outer Rim had ever produced. The single surviving drone moved through the outer ruins in the early hours. She reached a section of exposed rock face, one of the surface formations that had survived the bombardment structurally intact, rising in its irregular column against the amber sky, the way the surface formations of Geonosis had always risen. She stopped in front of it. She raised her wingtip. She drew it slowly across the rock, a single line, deliberate, the full extension of her arm. She held the position for a moment after the gesture was complete, not looking at what she had marked, looking past it, at the rock itself, at the stone that had been here before the hive and would be here after whatever came next. Then she began the work. Around her, the ruins extended in every direction, the broken geometry of a civilization that had built extraordinary things and been consumed by the most extraordinary thing it had ever produced. The silence where the foundries had been was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of an absence that had been a presence for so long that the absence had taken on presence of its own. The drone worked. The amber light continued. The stone kept everything it had been given. And somewhere in the specific frequency of the Force, that resonates in locations where enormous things have occurred, in the catacombs, in the arena, in the deep foundry, where the columns were spaced in a pattern that the engineering did not require. Something continued that had no name and required none. Not a ghost, not a memory, an echo, the kind that does not fade with distance, the kind that the stone holds indefinitely, the kind that anyone who stands in that particular place and goes quiet enough will receive, not as sound, but as the specific pressure of something that was completely, and is now completely gone, and left the shape of its having been here in everything it touched. The hive was gone. The foundries were silent. The weapon he designed was orbiting a dead star somewhere, in a system that no longer had a name worth recording. And a drone who had never known his name made his gesture in the ruins of his world, in the amber light that had always looked like the end of something, at the beginning of a day that had no foundry sound beneath it. Just rock, just light, just the line drawn across the surface, and then the work, and then the silence after. There is no bridge from here. There is only this, a name given in a warm chamber before a creature could speak, and everything that name became the reason for building, and the building itself, and what the building produced, and what the production cost, and the silence at the end of the cost. The listener carries this into sleep, not as a lesson, not as a warning, as the specific, unresolved weight of a life that was real, that happened, that mattered, that left its mark on the galaxy in ways that outlasted the creature who made them by decades, and in ways that will outlast the memory of his name by longer still. He tried to prove a verdict wrong. He built everything he had toward that proof. And the galaxy, indifferent and vast, and without the capacity for the kind of acknowledgement he had been seeking since before he could form words, simply continued. As it always does, as it always will. With or without the sound of the foundries. With or without the amber light. With the stone holding everything it has ever been given, quietly, without comment, for as long as stone lasts.